The man didn't even wait for the train to stop moving. Sheriff Dale Pruitt stepped onto the platform at Harwick Station with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his chest pushed out like he owned every plank of wood beneath his boots. He'd seen the passenger manifest. He knew exactly who was on that train, and he'd made up his mind before the wheels even stopped grinding. When the doors opened and the first boy stepped down, a teenager, lean and careful-eyed, helping a younger child find his footing on the step. Pruitt moved. He walked straight at them, not around, not to the side. Straight at them, so the boy had to stop or get knocked off his feet. "You Ashcroft?" Pruitt said. The boy looked up, said nothing. Pruitt leaned in close enough that the kid could smell the tobacco on his breath. "Tell your mother to turn around and get back on that train. We don't need what she's bringing into this town." He said it loud. He said it so the whole platform could hear. And then he smiled. If this story moved something in you, stay. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Because there are more stories like this one waiting. Stories about the people everyone overlooked and the lives they built anyway. Don't miss a single one. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The morning Garrett Holloway drove his wagon to Harwick Station, he wasn't thinking about much beyond the list in his coat pocket. He'd written it himself 3 nights ago, sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp that kept guttering in the draft coming through the gap under the back door. He'd been meaning to fix that gap since October. It was now the second week of November, and the cold that slipped through it at night had started feeling personal. The list was practical. Everything on it was practical. One experienced housekeeper, capable of heavy ranch work. Cooking for 8 to 12 men preferred. Familiarity with preserved goods, winter provisions, livestock feed schedules acceptable. Age and appearance immaterial. References required. He'd sent it to the Caldwell Placement Agency in Billings 6 weeks ago, along with a bank draft for their service fee. The response had come back in 10 days. Confirmation that a suitable candidate had been identified and would arrive on the November 14th northbound train. Garrett had not asked for anything beyond what was on the list. He was not a complicated man about most things. He tied his horse to the post outside the station house, tucked his coat collar up against the wind coming off the mountains, and went to wait on the platform. He was early. The train wasn't due for another 20 minutes, and the platform was quiet except for Dale Pruitt standing near the far end with 2 of his regular companions. Men whose names Garrett knew but didn't use if he could avoid it. Pruitt ran the Harwick Cattlemen's Association, which meant he ran most of the social architecture of the valley. He had a talent for making his opinions sound like consensus. Garrett nodded at him once. Pruitt nodded back. Neither of them moved toward the other. That was their arrangement, and it had been working for about 3 years. When the train finally pulled in, Garrett stayed where he was near the center of the platform. He watched the doors open. He watched a conductor step down, then a woman in a gray traveling coat carrying 2 bags stacked on top of each other, then a family of some kind, a man and wife with a small child, and then the boy. The boy was maybe 16, with a face that had already been asked to carry more than 16 years should require. He stepped down carefully, turned immediately, and reached back up into the doorway for someone. A hand came out first. A large hand, with work-cracked knuckles, and a grip that said it knew what it was doing. Then Mabel Ashcroft stepped off the train. Garrett would think about this moment later, more than once. He would try to be honest with himself about what he felt when he first saw her. Not what he was supposed to feel, not what he told himself afterward, but what actually moved through him in that first second. What he felt was surprise. Not revulsion, not the stab of regret that he'd expected to feel when something didn't match the plan. Just surprise. Because the woman who stepped off that train was not what the word housekeeper had conjured in his mind, and his mind scrambled briefly to catch up with what his eyes were showing it. She was large. There was no diplomatic way to think around it. She was a big woman, carrying a big woman's weight on a big woman's frame, and she'd been doing it long enough that she'd learned to move with a kind of deliberate efficiency that smaller people sometimes never bothered to develop. She had a good face, strong jaw, steady eyes, the kind of lines around the mouth that come from a life that mixed hard work with genuine feeling. Behind her came 3 more boys. Garrett counted them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. Stepping down from the train in descending order of height, each one watching the platform before he put his full weight on it, each one moving to one side to make room for the next. 4 boys total, including the oldest. He stared at them for a moment. Then he looked at the woman, then back at the boys. That was when Pruitt moved. He came from the far end of the platform with that particular walk he had, not fast, not aggressive in any obvious way, but pointed, like a man who knew he was about to do something he'd planned and was pleased about the planning. He walked straight at the oldest boy, stopped close enough to make the kid pull back half a step. "You Ashcroft?" Pruitt said. The boy's eyes went to his mother first, just a flicker. "Tell your mother to turn around and get back on that train," Pruitt said. "We don't need what she's bringing into this town." The platform wasn't large. Everyone heard it. The woman in the gray coat heard it. The conductor heard it. Garrett heard every word. Mabel Ashcroft heard it. She didn't flinch. That was the thing Garrett noticed. She heard every syllable of what Pruitt said, and she didn't flinch. And she didn't look at the ground. She looked directly at Dale Pruitt with a steadiness that Garrett found himself paying attention to. "Nathan," she said quietly to the oldest boy, "take your brothers and wait by the bags." Nathan moved. The other boys moved with him. Mabel walked toward Pruitt. She wasn't storming, wasn't rushing. She just walked toward him the way a woman walks toward a fence post she's going to have to deal with, and she stopped about 4 feet from him and looked at him. "I didn't catch your name," she said. Pruitt blinked. It was brief, but Garrett caught it. "Dale Pruitt. I run the Cattlemen's—" "I didn't ask what you run," Mabel said. "I asked your name. You have it now." She looked at him for another moment with that same steadiness. "I'm not here for your opinion, Mr. Pruitt. I'm here because I was sent for." She turned away from him and looked across the platform. Her eyes found Garrett. He was aware suddenly that he'd been standing perfectly still for the last 2 minutes. He became aware of it the way you become aware of holding your breath, all at once, and slightly embarrassed. He walked toward her. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, "I'm Garrett Holloway." She studied him. The study was quick but thorough, the kind of look someone gives when they've learned not to waste time on surfaces. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding between you and the agency." "Looks like." "I was told I was coming to a marriage arrangement." She said it without any heat in it, just laid it out flat. "I am a widow with 4 sons. I suspect you were told something rather different." "Housekeeper," Garrett said. "That's what they confirmed." She nodded, once, like she was filing it away. "I see." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her doing something behind her eyes that wasn't panic. It was calculation. She was running numbers on a situation she hadn't expected and figuring out what was still workable. "I have no claim on you," she said. "I understand that. If you want us to go back, where would you go?" The question came out before he'd entirely finished deciding to say it. She looked at him. "We'd manage," she said. But something in the words had a slight delay before they came, and Garrett Holloway had spent enough years around livestock and hired hands to know when someone was saying a true thing they hadn't fully worked out yet. He looked past her at the 4 boys standing by the pile of bags. The youngest one, he couldn't have been more than 6, had his hand wrapped tight around the strap of a battered canvas satchel, like it was the one thing in the world that was definitely his. He was watching Garrett with eyes that were trying hard not to be scared and not quite succeeding. Garrett looked at Pruitt, who was still standing nearby wearing the expression of a man who expected to be thanked for his helpfulness. Then he looked back at Mabel Ashcroft. "I've got 40 head of cattle that need moving before the first hard freeze," he said. "I've got a kitchen that hasn't been right since my cook left in August. I've got a barn roof that needs patching, a fence line on the north quarter that I can't get to alone, and 7 ranch hands who eat like they're being paid extra for it." He paused. "Mrs. Ashcroft, how long have you been working?" She tilted her head slightly. "Since I was 9. "Good," Garrett said. He looked at the boys again, at Nathan with his careful eyes, at the second boy who was watching the mountains like they meant something to him, at the third one who had already started quietly reorganizing the bags into a more efficient arrangement, at the youngest still gripping his satchel. "Good," he said again, louder this time. "I need every one of you." Pruitt made a sound. It was the kind of sound a man makes when he wants to say something but hasn't committed to the words yet. Garrett turned and looked at him. Not hard. Not with any theatrics. Just looked. "Dale," he said, "I appreciate you coming out." He picked up one of Mabel's bags. He looked at Nathan. You want to grab that other one? Nathan looked at his mother. Mabel gave the smallest of nods. Nathan grabbed the bag. They walked off the platform together, and Garrett Holloway did not look back at Dale Pruitt, and Pruitt did not say anything else. And that was the end of the first moment. It would not be the end of Pruitt. The wagon road from Harwick to the Holloway Ranch was 11 miles, and for the first 4 of them, nobody said much of anything. The youngest boy, Micah, Garrett would learn, fell asleep against his mother's arm inside of 20 minutes, which Garrett figured said something about how long they'd been traveling. The other 3 sat in the wagon bed with their backs to the sides, and each of them managed to find something on the landscape to study that wasn't Garrett's face. Mabel sat on the bench beside him. She had both her hands in her lap and she was looking at the road ahead, and he could tell she was letting the silence run because she was busy thinking. He let it run too. After a while she said, "What happened to your cook?" "Left in August. His brother had a farm in Oregon. Better money." "And you didn't replace him before winter?" "Tried twice. First one lasted 6 days. Second one looked at the bunkhouse and kept walking. She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh but had the same basic shape." "And the agency?" "I sent for what I needed," he said. "I didn't ask for—" He stopped. Thought about how to finish that. "I wasn't looking for a wife." "Nor were you expecting 4 children," she said. "No." "I should tell you about them," she said, "so you know what you've agreed to." "Go ahead." She turned slightly on the bench, just enough to speak without projecting past him. "Nathan is 16. He's been running the family since his father died, and he's been doing it longer than a 16-year-old should have to. He's good at most things and doesn't know it. He also has a temper when he thinks someone is being treated unjustly, which has cost him 2 jobs. Garrett nodded. "Elias is 13. He has a mind for numbers and patterns. Weather, mostly. He's been predicting storms since he was 8. People think he's strange. He's not. He just pays attention to things other people don't bother with. That's useful. Very. Jonah is 10. He fixes things. Anything broken, tools, hinges, harnesses, he figures it out. He doesn't talk much, but he watches everything." She paused. "And Micah is 6. He just needs to be somewhere safe for a while." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "Their father. 3 years ago. Fever." She said it without softness or hardness, just fact. "I'm sorry." "Thank you." She didn't expand on it. He said, "What were you doing before the agency?" "Laundry service. Before that, cleaning in a hotel. Before that, whatever was available." She looked at the mountains, and something in her expression shifted just slightly. Not grief exactly, but the kind of look people get when they've carried something a long distance and they can feel exactly how heavy it is. "We've moved 4 times in 3 years, Mr. Holloway. Different towns. Same story everywhere we landed." He wanted to ask what story, but he thought he probably knew. She said it anyway, without being asked. "People see what I look like and they decide before I've done anything. And then they watch everything I do for the first sign they were right." He said nothing because there wasn't anything adequate. "I'm not telling you that so you'll feel sorry for me," she said. "I'm telling you so you know what you're dealing with and what you're not." She looked at him directly. "I work hard. I don't complain. My sons work hard. We take care of what's given to us. But I cannot pretend to be something I'm not, and I won't ask my boys to do it either." Garrett kept his eyes on the road for a moment. "I don't remember asking you to," he said. She studied the side of his face. He could feel it. "No," she said after a moment. "I suppose you didn't." They rode in silence for another mile. The mountains grew closer. The sky was the particular shade of gray that comes before the first serious winter clouds, and the wind had a smell to it that Garrett recognized, the kind of cold that arrives and doesn't hurry back. "From the wagon bed," the second boy said, without looking up from the horizon. "Storm coming in about 3 days." Garrett looked over his shoulder. "That right?" Elias looked at him then. He had a still kind of face, intelligent in a way that didn't announce itself. "The clouds on the northwest ridge, the way they're moving. 3 days. Maybe 4 if the wind shifts." He paused. "Probably 3. Garrett studied the northwest ridge for a moment. "My hands think it's a week out," he said. Elias said nothing. He just went back to looking at the mountains with that same unhurried attention. Garrett turned back to the road. "Good to know," he said. The Holloway Ranch house was not a beautiful building. It was a solid building. 2 stories, gray-weathered wood, a porch that needed paint and got none, windows that held the light without apology. It sat in a wide spread of land with the barn to one side and the bunkhouse another 30 yards past that, and everything about it had the look of a place where the practical had won every argument with the decorative for about 20 years running. When the wagon pulled up, 3 of Garrett's hands were visible, 2 splitting wood by the barn and 1 on the roof of a lean-to shed attempting something that didn't appear to be going well. They stopped what they were doing. The one on the roof sat up and shaded his eyes. Garrett climbed down from the wagon. He looked at his hands and said, with the plainness he applied to most things, "This is Mrs. Ashcroft and her sons. They'll be staying. Nathan there can help Pete with the fence line. Elias, Jonah. I'll figure out where to put you in the morning." He looked at Micah, who had woken up when the wagon stopped and was now standing in the wagon bed blinking. "And that one's too small for most things, so he stays out of the way of everything that moves." Micah stared at him. Garrett stared back. Micah said, "I'm not too small." Garrett said. He turned toward the house. "Kitchen's through the back, firewood stacked on the east side, dry stack only, green stacks for emergencies, root cellars around the back, lamp oils on the second shelf in the pantry." He paused at the porch steps. "You'll see what's wrong with the kitchen soon enough. If you have opinions about it, I'll hear them." Mabel stood in the yard and looked at the house. She looked at it the way someone looks at a problem they've decided to solve. "I'll need a full inventory of provisions," she said. "It's in the ledger on the pantry shelf." "And the stove?" "Burns left. You have to bank the coals to the right side or the back of the oven goes cold." She nodded. She looked at him. "What time do the men eat?" 6 in the morning, noon, 6 at night." "What have they been eating?" He was quiet for a moment. "Salt pork, beans, biscuits if someone remembered to make them." Her expression did something complicated. "For how long?" "August. 3 months." "About." She looked at the house again. Then she said, in a tone that was less distress and more assessment, "I'm going to need lard, dried fruit if there's any, and someone to bring in the last of whatever's in that root cellar." "Jonah," Nathan said immediately, already reading the situation. Jonah slid out of the wagon without being asked and headed for the root cellar. Mabel started toward the house, and then she stopped and turned back to Garrett. "Mr. Holloway." "Yeah." "What you did back there?" "At the station." She didn't finish the sentence, but she looked at him with something that wasn't gratitude exactly, because gratitude implies you expected to be given less. It was something more than that. "I needed the help," he said. She looked at him for another second. "Yes," she said. "I expect you did." She went inside. The hand's reaction to the new arrangement took about 48 hours to clarify itself. The first night, they ate what Mabel put together from what she found in the kitchen, which was impressive considering what she found in the kitchen, and there was a long silence around the table when the food arrived. That was not the silence of dissatisfaction. It was the silence of 7 men who had been eating salt pork for 3 months, encountering something that smelled of onion and sage and meat drippings and something they couldn't identify but wanted more of. The one called Pete said, "What is this?" "Stew," Mabel said. "Out of what?" "What was available," she said, and didn't elaborate, and nobody pushed. After dinner, one of the younger hands, Roy, 22, from somewhere in Nebraska, helped Nathan carry wood in from the porch without being asked. Garrett noticed. He filed it. The second morning, Mabel was already in the kitchen when Garrett came down at 5, and the coffee was ready, and she was working on something at the stove without looking up when he came in. "Slept all right?" he said. "Fine," she said. "Boys are in the room at the end of the hall. Is that acceptable?" "That's fine." She turned from the stove. She was wearing a work apron over her dress, and she had her sleeves rolled up, and she looked at him with that directness she seemed to default to in the mornings. "I found the ledger." "And?" "You have been losing provisions to rot in the root cellar for at least 6 weeks," she said. "There's a moisture problem on the east side. Someone needs to fix the drainage before the real freeze. I'll put Jonah on it." She nodded. "Also, your lard supply is adequate, but your flour is wrong." "Wrong how?" "The brand. It's cut with something, cornstarch, I think, which is why whoever was making the biscuits couldn't get them to rise properly. You've been paying for inferior product, Mr. Holloway. Whoever sold you that flour was taking advantage. Garrett looked at her. I'll take it up with the merchant, he said. Might be worth knowing who recommended the supplier, she said, without inflection. Garrett thought about Dale Pruitt, who sat on the Merchants Association board in Harwick, who had a cousin who ran a dry goods operation on the south end of town. Might be, he said. The breakfast she produced that morning was the kind that earned a specific kind of silence. Not the polite silence of social obligation, but the internal, focused silence of people applying themselves to something that deserved it. Roy ate 3 helpings. The hand named Clem, who had not been voluble on any subject in the month Garrett had known him, said ma'am when she passed him the bread in a tone that had genuine feeling in it. Nathan sat at the end of the table and ate with the slightly stunned expression of a teenage boy watching his mother be good at something in front of other people and not knowing what to do with the feeling. Garrett watched all of this and said nothing and thought a number of things. On the 3rd day, Elias's storm came in. Not in 3 days. In 2.5. It came in the early afternoon, which Elias had noted the morning of the 3rd day with a flat look at the northwest sky and the single word sooner. And it was not catastrophic, not yet, but it had intent. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours. The wind came from the wrong direction, circular and confused, which was a sign Garrett had learned to read in his first winter on this land, as meaning the thing wasn't done deciding yet. He brought the hands in early and set them to checking the barn fastenings and the bunkhouse stovepipes. He told them to bring the 2 oldest horses into the covered section and to make sure the water trough beside the north pasture had enough flow to resist freezing overnight. He was in the barn checking the roof tie-downs when Nathan appeared in the doorway. My brother says it's going to be worse tonight than it looks right now, Nathan said. Garrett looked up from the rope in his hands. He does. He's usually right. So I'm finding out. He went back to the knot. What else does he say? Nathan stepped inside. He still had that careful quality, not fearful, just measuring. Like he'd learned to be sure of the ground before he put his weight on it. He says the wind's going to come from the north by dark, Nathan said, and that the temperature will drop fast. He's worried about the cattle on the far ridge. Garrett was quiet for a moment. The far ridge was the north quarter. He had 12 head up there that he'd been planning to move tomorrow. You say anything else? Garrett said. He said to go now, not in the morning. Garrett looked at the roof of the barn. Then he looked at Nathan. You know how to ride? Since I was 8. Can you handle rough ground in the dark? Nathan looked at him with an expression that was not bragging but was very certain. My father ranched in Wyoming before he got sick. I've done this. Garrett dropped the rope. Come on then. He did not ask for the other hands because 2 men moving quickly were worth more than 6 men moving with uncertainty, and because something in Nathan's certainty had weight to it that Garrett respected without being able to entirely explain. They got the cattle off the far ridge in 2 hours and 12 minutes, moving through the deteriorating light with Nathan flanking on the uphill side and Garrett driving from below, and the cattle moving with the irritated cooperation of animals who don't understand the urgency but trust the direction. The temperature was dropping the whole time. By the time they had the last of the 12 through the lower gate, Garrett's hands were stiff in his gloves and the wind had indeed come around to the north. They rode back in near darkness, not talking, the horses working steadily. At the barn gate, Nathan said, Elias said you'd listen. Garrett looked at him. What? He said, when I asked if I should tell you about the cattle, Elias said, tell him, he'll listen. Nathan paused. Most people don't. Listen to him. Garrett got down from his horse. He thought about that. He's paying attention to the right things, Garrett said. Why wouldn't I listen? Nathan didn't say anything, but something in his face shifted. The careful part loosening just a fraction, the way it does when something you expected to go wrong doesn't. They put the horses up and went inside. Mabel was in the kitchen when they came through the door, and she had a lamp lit and something on the stove, and she looked up at them when they came in. At Nathan first, then Garrett, and then she looked back at the stove. There's water heating, she said. Your hands are going to hurt when they warm up. Nathan went to the basin. Garrett stood near the doorway for a moment, pulling his coat off, feeling the heat of the kitchen begin to replace the cold that had settled into his shoulders. Micah was sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil, working on something with great seriousness. He looked up when Garrett came in. Did you get the cows? Micah asked. Cattle, Garrett said. And yes, Elias said you would. Elias seems to say a lot of useful things. Micah nodded like this was not news. He knows things, he said simply, and went back to his paper. Mabel set a cup of something hot on the table near Garrett's usual chair without being asked and went back to the stove. He sat down. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He could hear the wind picking up outside, and the kitchen was warm, and from the table where Micah was drawing something, there was the soft sound of pencil on paper. He had not had this in a long time. He couldn't have named what it was exactly. Not comfort. That wasn't quite it. Something more like the sense that the edges of the day were defined, that there was a center to come back to, that the kitchen was occupied by people who were, all of them, doing what they were supposed to be doing. He drank from the cup. Outside, the wind pushed at the windows, and the temperature kept dropping, and whatever was coming was still coming. But the cattle were in, the barn was fastened, the stovepipes were clear, and Elias had been right about the storm. Garrett found himself wondering what else the boy was right about. And then, somewhere underneath that thought, quieter and less formed, another one. What it would mean when the agency inevitably followed up on their mistake, and what would happen to this kitchen and the people in it when that letter arrived. He put the thought away. There was nothing to do about it tonight, but it sat there, patient, at the back of everything else. He turned the cup in his hands and listened to Micah's pencil moving across the paper, and the wind outside pushing harder against the glass, and Mabel moving at the stove with the practiced, unhurried rhythm of a woman who knew how to work in a cold winter kitchen. And he did not look up, and he did not speak, and the warmth held. The storm that Elias had called broke before dawn on the fourth day, and by the time it finished, it had dropped 8 inches of snow across the valley and left the kind of cold behind it that settled into the ground and intended to stay. Garrett was out before 5, checking what the night had done to the property. The barn roof had held. The cattle he and Nathan had moved off the far ridge were restless but intact. The north fence along the main pasture had a section that had buckled under the snow weight, but it was repairable. One of the lean-to shed walls had shifted on its foundation, which was a problem for later. He came back inside and found Mabel already at the stove and Elias sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper covered in what appeared to be notations of some kind, numbers and small markings that Garrett didn't recognize. "How bad?" Mabel said, without turning from the stove. "Manageable," Garrett said. He poured coffee. "Your boy's storm did 8 inches. "I said 7 to 9, Elias said, not looking up from his paper. So, Garrett agreed. Elias made a small mark on his paper. Garrett watched him for a moment. "What is that you're writing?" he said. "Records," Elias said. "Temperature, wind direction, pressure. I track the barometric pressure from the way the horses behave and how the creek sounds. I've been doing it for 2 years. He finally looked up. "The patterns repeat." "Not exactly, but close enough to be useful." Garrett pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. He looked at the paper. The notations were small and precise, organized in columns with dates along the left margin. It was neater than most of the bookkeeping Garrett had seen from grown men. "You taught yourself this?" Garrett said. "My father started it," Elias said. "He kept weather records. I kept going after." He paused, and something moved across his face briefly. Not grief exactly, more like the acknowledgement of an absence, quick and then contained. "The method is mostly mine now." Garrett nodded. He looked at the paper another moment, then back at his coffee. "I've got a fence section down on the north pasture," he said, "and I need to look at the shed wall before the next weather comes in. When's the next one?" Elias turned his paper over and looked at the back, where there were more notations. 5 days. Maybe 6. It'll be colder than this one." "Colder?" "Significantly." Garrett drank his coffee and thought about that. "All right," he said. 5 days. The letter from Dale Pruitt to the Cattlemen's Association arrived in Harwick on the same day that Roy Sutter, Garrett's youngest hand, came back from town with 2 weeks' worth of provisions and a look on his face that said he'd heard something he didn't know what to do with. Garrett was in the yard when Roy drove the supply wagon in, and he could read the expression from 20 feet. "What?" Garrett said. Roy climbed down from the wagon seat and handed over the receipt without looking directly at him. "People in town are talking," he said. "People in town are always talking." "This is different talking." Roy finally looked up. He was a straightforward kid, Nebraska-born, no skill at pretending he hadn't heard what he'd heard. Pruitt's been telling people that you've gone soft, that you took on a liability instead of a worker, that the widow's going to eat through your provisions before February and you'll be borrowing against the ranch by spring. Garrett was quiet. He's also saying, Roy continued, with the slightly pained look of someone delivering news they'd rather not, that the placement agency made an error and that you'd have been within your rights to send her back. I know about the error, Garrett said. Roy blinked. You do? The agency wrote me. Garrett looked at the supply wagon. Start unloading. I'll get Nathan. Mr. Holloway. Roy. Is it true? That you knew and you kept them anyway? Garrett picked up one of the flour sacks from the wagon bed. He looked at Roy. Unload the wagon, he said. Roy unloaded the wagon. But that evening, after supper, Garrett sat at the kitchen table with the letter from the agency in front of him. He'd read it 3 times already. It was politely worded and absolutely clear. The Caldwell Placement Agency regretted the administrative error that had resulted in Mrs. Mabel Ashcroft's placement at the Holloway Ranch under the incorrect category of matrimonial arrangement. They were prepared to facilitate her relocation to a more suitable situation at no additional cost. They requested his response within 30 days. 30 days. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. He had not yet decided what to do with it. The Harwick Cattlemen's Association met on the first Thursday of every month in the back room of Doyle's hardware store, a tradition that had been established by the previous generation and maintained mostly through inertia and the fact that Doyle provided coffee. Garrett had attended these meetings irregularly since buying the ranch 6 years ago. He went when there was something practical on the agenda and stayed home when it was mostly Pruitt explaining his positions at length. He went to the November meeting. He was the 3rd man through the door, which meant he got to watch Pruitt's face when he walked in. The expression Pruitt managed was professionally neutral, which cost him something. Garrett could see the cost. There were 8 other men in the room. Some of them nodded at Garrett. A couple of them didn't quite meet his eyes, which told him the conversation had been going on longer than just the last 2 days. Pruitt called the meeting to order and got through the practical business first: road maintenance, water rights on the southern tributary, a proposal about cooperative fence maintenance that nobody could agree on. Garrett said nothing through any of it and kept his face easy. Then Pruitt shifted his weight and said, with the particular tone of a man introducing a topic he'd planned, "There's a secondary matter I want the group to address. It concerns the standards we hold ourselves to as ranchers in this valley, and what happens when one of our own makes a decision that reflects on all of us." Nobody in the room looked at Garrett, which meant they all were thinking about him. Now, I'm not going to name names, Pruitt said, in the way people say that when they absolutely intend to name names. But word has gotten around about a situation up on one of the northern properties. A situation involving let's call it an irregular arrangement that I think sets a poor example for the community. Garrett said, "Say what you mean, Dale." Pruitt looked at him. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not surprise, more like a man who'd prepared for a certain kind of confrontation and was sorting out whether this was it. "I'm talking about the woman you brought home from the station," Pruitt said. "Her name is Mabel Ashcroft," Garrett said. "She's my housekeeper. Say her name if you're going to say anything at all." "Housekeeper." Pruitt let the word sit there. "That's what you're calling it." "That's what it is." "Garrett." Pruitt's voice shifted into something that was performing patience. "You brought home a woman who is not physically suited to the demands of a working ranch. You brought home 4 children who are a drain on your resources. And now you're telling me this was a practical business decision?" "I'm telling you," Garrett said, "that my provisions are in better order than they've been in 3 months. My men are eating 2 kinds of food instead of 1. My North Ridge cattle survived the last storm because someone paid attention to the weather, my root cellar drainage is repaired, and 3 of the 4 boys are pulling weight equivalent to an adult hand." He paused. "So yes, it was a practical business decision." Pruitt looked at the other men in the room. He had the look of a man who'd expected a different kind of conversation and was adjusting. "She's been there a week," he said. "She has." "You're willing to vouch for all of that based on 1 week?" "I'm willing to report what I've observed," Garrett said. "Same as I'd report of the weather. It is what it is." A man named Callum Briggs, who ran a sheep operation on the east side of the valley, and generally kept his own counsel, said quietly, "What does she cook, Garrett?" Pruitt turned slightly. Garrett looked at Briggs. "Why?" "Because Roy Sutter was in the feed store yesterday talking about a stew that put him off salt pork permanently," Briggs said. "And Roy is not what I'd call a man given to exaggeration about food." There was a brief silence. Pruitt said, "That's not—" "I'm just asking," Briggs said mildly. "Beef stew with onions and dried sage," Garrett said. "First night. She's been varying it since. My men show up on time for meals now, which was not previously a reliable feature of ranch operations." Someone toward the back made a sound that was almost a laugh. Pruitt looked around the room. He had the expression of a man watching a conversation drift somewhere he hadn't planned. "The point," he said, with a slight sharpness entering his voice, "is about appearances, about what this valley stands for, about whether we want to be the kind of community that—" "Dale," said a man named Hendricks, who was 62 and had the reputation of a man who'd heard most things twice. "You're talking about what she looks like." Pruitt's jaw tightened. "That is what this is," Hendricks said. "You've dressed it up in words about community standards and practical concerns, but what you walked into Garrett's business about is what the woman looks like." He looked around the room, and I'm going to say, because apparently someone should, that I don't see how that's any of our business or anybody's business but Garrett's. The room was quiet. Pruitt said, "I'm concerned about—" "I know what you're concerned about," Hendricks said. He didn't say it unkindly, just flatly. "And I'm telling you it's the wrong concern." Garrett looked at Hendricks. Hendricks looked back at him with the mild, unimpressed expression of a man who'd watched people argue about the wrong things for decades and had developed a very low tolerance for it. The meeting ended without resolution on the secondary matter because there was no vote to call and no action Pruitt could formally demand. He had made his position clear. A few men had signaled where they stood by saying nothing when they could have agreed with him. Garrett drove home in the cold and thought about the letter in his coat pocket. Mabel noticed something was different that evening at supper. She noticed because she was the kind of person who tracked the room without appearing to, who registered changes in how people held themselves, and whether they were looking at each other or not. Garrett ate and said almost nothing, which was not unusual. But his usual quiet had a quality to it that was different from that night's quiet, and she clocked the difference. After supper, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and the boys were in the back room, she was cleaning the kitchen, and he was still at the table. She said, "Something happened in town." He looked up. "Roy had an expression when he came back," she said, "and now you have one." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded letter and set it on the table between them. She dried her hands on her apron and sat down. She picked up the letter and read it. She read it slowly, the way someone reads something they want to get exactly right. Then she set it down and looked at her hands on the table. The silence lasted longer than most silences in that kitchen. "How long have you had this?" she said.
4 days. She absorbed that. "You were going to tell me." "Yes, but not yet." "No, not yet." She looked at the letter again. "The 30 days. It's what they offered. And Pruitt." She didn't elaborate, but the way she said the name said enough. "He doesn't know about the letter," Garrett said. "He's working from what he saw at the station and what he's decided since then. He's been talking to people." "He has." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What is it you're trying to figure out, Mr.
"Holloway. Because I don't think you kept this letter because you didn't know what to do with it. I think you kept it because you knew what you wanted to do with it, and you weren't sure if that was the right thing." Garrett looked at her. She waited. He said, "You've been here a week and a half." "I have." "That's not long enough for either of us to be certain of anything." "No," she said, "it's not. But long enough to see some things clearly." She said nothing. She waited for him to say the thing he was working toward. "I don't want to send you back," he said. "Any of you. That's the truth of it, and I know it's not practical to feel certain about something in 11 days. But the ranch is working in a way it hasn't in 2 years, and—" He stopped, looked at the table. "And Micah came in yesterday and told me one of the horses had loose shoe, and he was right, and I wouldn't have caught it for another 2 days. And I don't know what to do with the fact that I notice things like that now." Mabel looked at him for a long moment. "You notice them," she said. Because there are people around you who are paying attention. That's all that is. Maybe, he said. My boys haven't had that, she said. Someone paying attention who isn't me or them. She picked up the letter and held it. You understand what this means to them, especially Nathan. He's been the adult in our family for 3 years. He's been so busy being responsible that he forgot how to just be 16. She set the letter down. He came to supper last week and he told a joke. A real one, not the kind someone tells to ease tension. Just a joke because he thought of something funny. I haven't seen him do that in 3 years. Garrett said nothing.
I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight, Mabel said. She stood up and picked up the letter and held it out to him. But I want you to know that whatever you decide, I'm not going to make it harder than it has to be. I've done hard things. I know the shape of them. He took the letter. She went back to the kitchen. He sat at the table for a while longer, listening to the fire settle in the stove and the wind outside starting to build again, and somewhere in the back of the house, one of the boys talking to another one, and then quiet. He folded the letter. He put it back in his pocket. He was no closer to the answer, but he felt, oddly, less alone with the question. What? 3 days after the cattlemen's meeting, Callum Briggs drove his wagon up to the Holloway ranch on the pretext of asking about a fence post supplier, which Garrett recognized as a pretext because Briggs had been buying his fence posts from the same place for 12 years. Garrett invited him in for coffee. Mabel poured it without being asked and went back to what she was doing, which was annotating the provision ledger with a set of efficiency notes in handwriting that Garrett had already noticed was considerably cleaner than his own. Briggs watched her for a moment. Then he looked at Garrett. My wife wants to know if she'd be willing to share a receipt for something, Briggs said. For the bread. Roy Sutter mentioned bread at some point, and I've been hearing about it from Margaret for 2 days. Mabel looked up from the ledger without turning around. Which kind? Briggs blinked. There's more than one kind? Depends on what you have available, Mabel said. If she has dried apples, there's a sweet bread that works well in winter. If it's plain flour she wants something for, I can write down the method I use for the pull-apart loaves. Briggs looked at Garrett with an expression that was part amusement and part something else. Both, he said, if it's not too much trouble. No trouble, Mabel said. She set down her pen and picked up a piece of paper from the shelf. Garrett drank his coffee and watched Briggs track the kitchen. The new organization of the shelves, the inventory marks on the storage jars, the way everything was where it should be and nothing was where it shouldn't. You did all this? Briggs said to Mabel. The boys helped, she said. Jonah built the second shelf on the east wall. The spacing is better for the taller jars. Briggs found Jonah in the corner of the kitchen, which he hadn't noticed before because Jonah had the ability to be almost entirely unobtrusive when he was working on something. He was currently repairing a hinge on the pantry door with the focused attention of a surgeon. How old are you? Briggs said. Jonah looked up. 10. Who taught you hinges? My father, Jonah said, and trial and error. He looked at the hinge. Mostly trial and error. Briggs looked at Garrett again. Dale's wrong, he said in a low, even tone. I thought he was wrong at the meeting, and I think he's more wrong now. But you know how he is? He doesn't let things alone. I know, Garrett said. He's talking to Walsh and Morrison. Not about this specifically, about you generally, your water rights on the North Tributary. Garrett set down his cup. The North Tributary water rights had been a background dispute for 2 years, a matter of a survey line that was ambiguous and a seasonal creek that both the Holloway Ranch and the Walsh property claimed access to. It had been civil so far. It had been, until now, the kind of thing that stayed quiet because neither side had a strong reason to push it. Walsh is listening to him? Garrett said. Walsh is always looking for someone to back him up, Briggs said. You know that. Pruitt's giving him a reason to push the survey question, and he's not going to need much more convincing. Garrett was quiet. Mabel set the written bread receipts on the table in front of Briggs without a word and went back to the ledger. Briggs folded the papers and put them in his coat. I'm not telling you what to do, Briggs said. I'm just telling you what I know. He looked at Mabel's back. And I'm telling you that at least 4 men in that room last Thursday were paying more attention to what you said about the ranch operations than they let on. He left shortly after. Garrett sat with the cold coffee and the knowledge about Walsh settling into the back of his mind where it would sit until he figured out what to do with it. It was Elias who raised it first, which surprised Garrett, and then didn't.
The boy came to him that evening in the barn. Garrett was checking on a mare who'd been favoring her left foreleg, and he came the way he came to most things, directly and without preamble. "I heard what Mr. Briggs said today," Elias said. "About the water rights." Garrett looked up. "You were in the kitchen." "I was in the hallway," Elias said, without apology. "I wasn't eavesdropping on purpose. I just have good ears." Garrett went back to the mare's leg. "What about it?" "The north tributary." Elias leaned against the stall post. "I've been tracking the water flow as part of my weather records, because the creek behavior relates to precipitation patterns and ground temperature. I have about 14 months of data." Garrett looked at him. "The survey dispute," Elias said. "If it comes down to use patterns, who uses the water when, how much, I have documentation, more detailed than anything either side probably has." He paused. "I thought you should know that." Garrett studied the boy for a moment. 13 years old, standing in a barn in the cold, offering him 14 months of data he'd collected because he happened to find the patterns interesting. "Elias," Garrett said. "Yeah." "Why do you do this? The records. All of it." Elias was quiet for a moment. He seemed to be considering the question seriously, which was what he did with most questions. "Because things happen, and then they're gone," he said. "And if you don't write them down, it's like they didn't happen at all. And then you can't learn from them." He looked at the ceiling of the barn, where the rafters disappeared into the dark. "My father died, and nobody has a good record of who he was, except me and my brothers. And my mother. He came back down from wherever his eyes had gone. I don't want things to be gone without anyone being able to prove they were real." Garrett didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Bring me the records, when you're ready." Elias nodded. He pushed off the stall post and headed for the barn door. "Elias." The boy stopped. "What you said about your father," Garrett said. "I think he'd be glad you're doing what you're doing." Elias stood with his back to Garrett for just a moment. Then he kept walking. Garrett turned back to the mare. Well, the change in the ranch hands was gradual enough that it was easy to miss day to day, but it had a direction, and Garrett could see it when he stepped back far enough. Roy had started arriving at the barn 10 minutes early in the mornings, which he hadn't done before. The reason, Garrett eventually identified, was that Mabel had started putting a covered plate for early risers on the kitchen shelf, and Roy liked to eat something hot before the cold work of the day started, and the change in his morning behavior had come entirely from that one small alteration in the kitchen routine. Clem, the most taciturn of the hands, had started eating his meals inside the house instead of taking his plate to the bunkhouse, which he'd been doing since his first week on the ranch. Nobody commented on this. It simply was. Pete and Nathan had developed a working rhythm on the fence line that Garrett had watched with quiet attention. The way a 16-year-old and a 28-year-old found the syntax of a shared task without talking about it much, each figuring out what the other could do and adjusting accordingly. Pete was a good hand, but he'd always worked at a slightly grudging pace, like a man conserving effort he wasn't sure was worth spending. Around Nathan, something in his pace had changed. He worked like someone who'd been reminded of what work was actually for. Garrett noticed these things. He filed them. What he didn't know was that Mabel was filing things too. She had a different practice than he did. He observed and cataloged. She observed and connected, built a picture of how people fit together, what each person needed that they weren't getting, what small adjustments made the whole thing run cleaner. It was not a skill she'd named for herself. She'd just always been able to see it. She'd seen it at the station, the shape of what Garrett Holloway was, and what he needed that he hadn't put on any list he'd sent to any agency. She'd seen it in the way he'd looked at her boys. Not with calculation, not with tolerance, but with a kind of careful, assessing attention that said he was looking at them as people who were real and specific and worth knowing. She had not expected that. She had expected, at best, tolerance. She had been ready for tolerance. She had made her peace with a life's worth of tolerance. What she got instead was something that kept catching her off guard. Garrett stopped by the kitchen one afternoon while she was working and stood for a moment looking at the new shelf arrangement Jonah had built. "This is better," he said. "The spacing," she said, "for the taller jars." "Yeah." He looked at it. "I've been meaning to fix that for 2 years. Jonah had it done in an afternoon." "I know." He turned from the shelf and looked at her directly. "You raised a good kid." She was quiet for a moment. I raised 4 good kids. You did, he said. And then he went back outside and the conversation was finished, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment with the weight of those 4 words, you did, that were so simple and so uncommon that they landed somewhere she hadn't expected to feel anything. Micah found the injured hawk on a Tuesday morning. He came into the kitchen with it cradled in both arms, moving with the extreme caution of someone carrying something fragile and determined not to break it, and he set it on the kitchen table before anyone could stop him, and said, "It fell out of the big pine by the creek. I think its wing is bent wrong." Mabel looked at the hawk. The hawk looked at Mabel. "Micah," she said. "It's hurt," he said. "I see that. We can't just leave it." She looked at her son. 6 years old, winter coat still buttoned crooked from when he'd run out of the house in a hurry, face entirely earnest and completely certain that this was going to be sorted out to the hawk's advantage. She looked at the bird. The wing was not broken, as far as she could see, more likely dislocated. She had not worked with raptors specifically, but she had been around enough animals to know the general territory. "Go get Garrett," she said. Garrett came in and looked at the hawk on the table and then at Micah and then at Mabel. "It's hurt," Micah said. "Yeah," Garrett said. He crouched slightly and looked at the bird's wing. "Can you fix it?" Micah said. "Maybe," Garrett said. He straightened. "Get me a clean cloth from the shelf and hold the door." What followed was 20 minutes of the kind of focused, imperfect, occasionally tense effort that did not go smoothly or cleanly or the way it would in a story where the animal is healed with grace. The hawk objected loudly and with its talons. Garrett swore once under his breath. Mabel held the bird's body still with the same unhurried competence she applied to most physical problems. Micah watched from 3 feet away with his hands clasped in front of him, and his face a perfect expression of concentrated hope. When it was done, the wing wrapped. The bird settled in a wooden crate lined with Micah's coat, which Micah had donated without being asked. Garrett washed his hands and looked at Micah. "It might still not make it," Garrett said. "You understand that." "I know," Micah said. "Not because we did anything wrong. Sometimes things don't make it." "I know," Micah said again. He looked at the crate. "But we tried." Garrett looked at the kid for a moment. 6 years old, standing in a Montana kitchen in a donated coat, completely sure of the value of the effort, even without certainty of the outcome. "Yeah," Garrett said. "We tried." He looked up and found Mabel watching him. She looked away first. The letter from the agency had been in his pocket for 3 weeks when the second letter arrived. This one was not from the Caldwell Placement Agency. It was from the Harwick Merchants Association, signed by 4 members, requesting a meeting regarding the Holloway Ranch's current purchasing arrangements and whether certain supply contracts needed to be revisited in light of recent changes in ranch management. Garrett read it twice. Then he read it a third time because the third time was when the specific phrasing resolved itself into what it was actually saying, which was that Dale Pruitt, or someone working along the same lines as Dale Pruitt, was making a move on the commercial relationship that kept the ranch supplied through winter. He set the letter on the table. Outside, the temperature had dropped again. Elias had warned him 3 days ago that the next system would be bigger than the last one. He'd been tracking a pressure pattern that was behaving like the setup for a hard, sustained freeze, the kind that could last a week. The cattle needed to be moved. The barn roof needed a second reinforcement pass. The north fence section, the one that had buckled in the last storm, had been repaired but would need checking before more serious weather hit. He had a ranch that was running better than it had in 2 years. He had a family in his house that had arrived by accident and stayed by something else. He had 2 letters in his coat pocket, and a man in town with the patience of someone who was used to winning by erosion rather than direct confrontation, and winter coming in like it intended to make a point. He folded both letters and put them back in his coat. He went to find Nathan. "I need the north fence checked before Thursday," he said. Nathan looked up from the harness he was working on. He read Garrett's face the way he'd learned to over the past weeks. Not prying, just noting. "Pete and me can do it tomorrow," Nathan said. "Good." Garrett paused. "I may need your brother's records, the water ones." Nathan nodded slowly. "I'll tell him." Garrett started to leave. Nathan said, "Is something wrong?" Garrett thought about the 2 letters. He thought about Pruitt. He thought about the coming storm that Elias had measured in pressure patterns and horse behavior. "Nothing I can't manage," he said. Nathan looked at him. Yet, Garrett added, honestly. And then he walked back toward the house, into the wind that was already picking up from the north, carrying the cold that Elias had promised, and the particular smell of weather that didn't intend to be brief. The storm. Elias had been tracking for 6 days, arrived on a Wednesday, and it did not arrive the way the previous one had, with a gradual dropping of temperature and a polite warning of clouds building on the northwest ridge. This one came in the night like something that had been deciding for a long time and had finally made up its mind. Garrett woke at 2 in the morning to a sound he recognized before he was fully conscious. The particular combination of wind velocity and roof stress that meant the weather had crossed from serious into dangerous. He was dressed and downstairs in 4 minutes. He didn't need a lamp because the snow was reflecting enough light through the windows to see by, and what he saw through the kitchen window stopped him for a second at the glass. The visibility was perhaps 30 feet, maybe less. He pulled on his coat and his second pair of socks over the first and his boots, and he was reaching for the door when he found Elias already sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. "How long have you been up?" Garrett said. "Hour and a half," Elias said. He had his records notebook open in front of him and a pencil in his hand. "I've been listening to the wind shift. What do you make of it?" Elias looked at his notebook. "It's going to run at least 12 hours, possibly 18. The pressure pattern I was tracking, it's deeper than I initially calculated. I was off." He said this last part with a particular flatness, the tone of someone who held himself to a standard and was accounting for where he'd fallen short. "You called the storm," Garrett said. "I undercalled the severity," Elias said. "What do I need to do in the next 2 hours?" Elias looked at his notes. "The East pasture cattle. If they haven't found shelter in the windbreak stand, they'll drift. In this wind, they could drift 2 miles before morning, and we won't find them until the temperature comes back up." He paused. "Which might be too late." Garrett went to the bunkhouse. He banged on the door twice and went in, and the hands were already stirring because the noise of the storm was the kind that got into dreams and pushed them toward waking. Roy sat up first. Pete was already reaching for his boots. "East pasture," Garrett said. "We need everyone. Now." He didn't wait for the questions. He went back to the barn and started saddling horses in the dark, and Nathan was there in 5 minutes in a coat that wasn't quite warm enough and boots he was still lacing. "I heard," Nathan said. "You don't have to—" "I know where the East pasture windbreak is," Nathan said. "You showed me last week. Let me come." Garrett looked at him. The boy's face was lit by the small lamp hanging from the barn rafter, and his jaw was set with that particular quality Garrett had come to recognize. Not recklessness, but commitment, the kind that comes from having decided the outcome matters more than the difficulty. "Stay within 10 feet of me," Garrett said. "Yes, sir," Nathan said. Garrett had not asked Nathan to call him that, and Nathan had not done it before, and neither of them acknowledged it now. They just saddled the horses and went out into the white. The East pasture cattle had not found the windbreak. What they had done was exactly what Elias had predicted: drifted. In the wind and the dark and the blowing snow, they had moved without direction, following the path of least resistance, which in a storm like this meant following the wind, which meant following it southeast, which meant following it toward the slope that dropped off toward the creek bottom, where the ground went soft and treacherous when the ice wasn't solid yet. They found the first group of 8 by nearly riding into them. The horses felt them before the men could see them, and Garrett's mare shied, and he caught her and held still and let his eyes adjust until the shapes resolved out of the white into cattle, standing with their backs to the wind and their heads down, miserable and immovable. "Drive them north," Garrett called to Roy over the wind. "To the left of the oak line." Roy went around. Nathan was already on the south side, moving his horse in a wide arc to come up behind the group. The cattle didn't want to move. They had the bovine stubbornness of animals who had decided that standing still was the best of their available options and needed significant convincing otherwise. It took 20 minutes to move 8 cattle a quarter mile in those conditions. They found the second group further on, 12 head, closer to the creek edge than Garrett liked. Getting them turned and moving north required Clem going down into the slope on foot at one point, which was the kind of thing that could go badly and didn't, mostly through luck and Clem's particular brand of unflappable stubbornness. They were 3 hours out before they'd accounted for all but 6. The 6 were the problem. Garrett and Nathan pushed south, past where it was sensible to go, following a set of tracks that the wind was erasing as fast as it made them. The temperature had dropped. Garrett couldn't have said to exactly what, but his face had stopped feeling cold and started feeling absent, which was the worst sign. "We should go back," Nathan said. "6 more," Garrett said. "We can't see anything." "I know where they'll go." "You—" Nathan pulled his horse alongside. His face was white across the cheekbones with the early stages of something Garrett didn't want to name. "How do you know?" "Because there's a cut in the south fence line I never fixed," Garrett said. "And cattle in a storm always find the gap." He'd been meaning to fix that cut since September. It had been on his list. The list he'd never gotten to because there wasn't enough of him to do all the things the list required. He pushed on. They found the 6 cattle through the fence gap, standing in the neighbor's east field in the relative shelter of a drainage ditch, which showed better sense than he'd expected from them. Getting them back through the gap, in the dark, in the wind, with 2 horses that were at the edge of their patience, took 45 minutes that cost Garrett the feeling in 2 fingers of his left hand. Riding back north with the 6 cattle ahead of them, Nathan said, quietly, into the wind, not performing the observation but just making it, "This is what you do every winter." "Most winters," Garrett said, "alone." "Last 2 winters mostly. Before that I had better help." Nathan was quiet for a moment. The snow was in his eyelashes and he was leaning into the wind with his whole body, and his horse was moving steady underneath him, doing what horses do when a decent rider trusts them. "You shouldn't be alone for this," Nathan said. Garrett didn't answer, not because he disagreed. They got back to the barn at 5:30 in the morning. Mabel was in the kitchen with the stove running hot and a lamp lit and water heating, and she looked at the 2 of them when they came through the door, at Nathan's face, at Garrett's left hand, and she didn't say anything dramatic. She pointed at the chair nearest the stove and said, "Sit." Garrett sat. She took his left hand and looked at the fingers and got a basin of water. Not hot, specifically, not hot, and put his hand in it, and the pain that came back into the fingers as the temperature normalized was considerable. Garrett made no particular sound about it, but his jaw was tight. "Nathan," she said, "there's a covered pot on the back of the stove, bowl and spoon on the shelf." Nathan moved. He was doing better than Garrett, having had better circulation and a younger body's heat, but he sat at the table with both hands wrapped around a bowl of something, and his eyes at half-mast with the exhaustion of someone who'd done a man's work in the middle of the night and was only now counting the cost. Elias appeared in the doorway. He looked at Garrett's hand in the basin and at his own notebook and then at Garrett. "I was off by 3 hours on the arrival time," he said, "and the severity." "You got the direction right," Garrett said through a slightly tight jaw, "and the drift warning was correct. I should have been more precise." "Elias," Mabel said, without looking up from Garrett's hand, "sit down and eat something." Elias sat down. The hawk, in its crate in the corner, made a sound. It had been making more sounds over the past week. A good sign, Micah had repeatedly informed everyone. It was a good sign. Garrett looked at the crate. Then he looked at the ceiling and thought about the barn roof, which had sounded different during the night, and about the east fence gap he hadn't fixed, and about the south barn wall he'd been meaning to look at since October. "The barn roof," he said. "I'll check it when it's light enough," Nathan said, without lifting his head from over the bowl. "The east fence gap. I know where it is," Nathan said. "I'll take Jonah." Garrett looked at him. Nathan finally looked up. His eyes were tired and steady. "You need to sleep for 2 hours," he said. "The storm's not letting up before noon. There's nothing either of us can do before it does." He looked back at his food. "I'll have a list ready when you wake up." Garrett looked at Mabel. She was watching him with an expression that agreed with her son and wasn't going to say so directly. He slept for 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was longer than he'd intended. And when he came back down, Nathan had a list on the kitchen table, and Jonah was already in the barn working on something Garrett hadn't asked him to work on, which turned out to be the east barn wall brace that had shifted in the night's wind. The storm dropped 14 inches before it was finished, and it left behind a cold that had the quality of permanence, the kind of cold that moved into a valley and started unpacking. 3 days after the storm, with the cleanup still ongoing and the fence repairs not yet complete, the letter from the Harwick Merchants Association arrived, the follow-up to the first one, which Garrett had not responded to. This letter was shorter and less politely worded. It stated that the Holloway Ranch's current credit arrangement with Dawson Mercantile, the primary supply contract that had covered provisions since the ranch's founding, was under review, and that pending the outcome of that review, fulfillment of winter supply orders could not be guaranteed. Garrett read it standing in the yard where Roy had handed it to him from the mailbag. He read it twice. He put it in his coat pocket. "Bad news?" Roy said. "Administrative matter," Garrett said. Roy looked at him with the expression of someone who understood that phrase and the thing it covered. Garrett went inside. He spread the letter on the kitchen table alongside Elias's water records, which the boy had organized into a bound set of pages with a summary notation on the first sheet that explained the methodology in clear, plain language that even a lawyer could parse. He looked at both documents for a while, thinking about how they fit together and what each one required. Mabel came in from the root cellar with a basket, saw him at the table, and set the basket down. "Walsh," Garrett said, "and Pruitt. They're going after the supply contract." She sat down. She looked at the letter. "Can they do that?" she said. "Dawson owes his line of credit to the bank, and the bank board has 3 members who belong to the Cattlemen's Association," Garrett said. "So technically it's the bank's decision, but yes, they can make it difficult." Mabel was quiet for a moment. "What does difficult mean, practically?" "It means I buy provisions at full price from whoever will sell to me, which doubles the cost, which cuts the operating margin by about 1/3. He paused. "It means a harder winter than I planned for." "And the water rights?" He looked at Elias's records. "That's the other part of it. Walsh has been quiet about the survey dispute for 2 years. If Pruitt's backing him now, he'll push it to a legal review, which costs money and time and creates uncertainty about the North Quarter, grazing I've been counting on." She looked at the records notebook. "Elias's documentation. It's the best record of actual water use I've got, better than anything Walsh has. The question is whether it carries weight in a formal proceeding." "It would carry weight," she said, with a certainty that made him look at her. "You know something about property law?" "My late husband spent 2 years trying to defend a water claim in Wyoming," she said. "We lost. But I learned more than I wanted to know about what evidence looks like when it matters." She pulled the records notebook toward her and looked at the first page. Usage records, duration, seasonal patterns, consistent documentation over an extended period. This is exactly the kind of evidence that changes outcomes. She looked up. "How old is your boy?" He blinked, then understood she meant Elias. 13. She looked at the notebook again. 13 years old, built a better case than the lawyer we hired in Wyoming. She set the notebook down. "You need to protect these records." "I intend to." "And you need someone in town who isn't afraid of Pruitt." "Briggs," Garrett said. "Possibly Hendricks." "Then talk to them, before Walsh files anything, before the supply issue gets formalized." She looked at him with that directness that he had, over the past weeks, stopped finding abrupt. "Pruitt is counting on you to respond slowly. He's built a reputation on the fact that reasonable men take their time, and unreasonable men use that time." Garrett looked at her. "My husband was a reasonable man," she said. It was not bitter. It was just true, and waited. And she said it once and didn't circle back. He stood up. "I'll go to town tomorrow morning." "Take Elias's records." "Yes." She started to stand. He said, "Mabel." She stopped. "I need to tell you something," he said. "About the agency letter." She was still for a moment. Then she sat back down. He looked at the table rather than at her, which was unusual for him, and she noticed it. "I wrote back to them," he said. 3 days ago, before the storm." She waited. "I told them the arrangement had resolved itself satisfactorily and that no further placement was required." He looked up then. "I should have told you before I sent it. That wasn't right. It was your decision as much as mine." She looked at him for a long time. "What made you decide?" she said. He thought about Nathan saying you shouldn't be alone for this. He thought about Micah and the hawk, and we tried. He thought about Elias in the barn with a notebook full of patterns no one else had bothered to track. He thought about Jonah fixing the wall brace nobody had asked him to fix. "I watched Nathan sleep in the saddle riding back from the east pasture," he said, "and I thought, that kid has been the head of a family since he was 13. He did that job for 3 years. And now he's doing it differently because somebody else is carrying part of the weight. He paused. I didn't want to take that away from him. Mabel was quiet for a while. You wrote back, she said. Yes. You didn't ask me. No, and I should have. She looked at the window. Outside, the snow was bright and hard in the morning sun, and the cold was absolute, and the valley was the kind of quiet that only comes after a serious storm. I would have said yes, she said. I thought you might. That's not the same as asking. She looked at him. Something in her face had a quality he hadn't seen before, not softness, because she wasn't a soft woman in any obvious way. Something more like recognition, like a person looking at someone and finding them slightly more comprehensible than they'd been before. No, she said. It's not. She stood up. Don't do that again. I won't, he said. She picked up her basket and went to the pantry. Garrett rode to Harwick the next morning in the cold that Elias had predicted would hold for at least 5 more days, and he went to Hendricks first because Hendricks was the older of the two men and had the steadier judgment. Hendricks read the Merchants Association letter at his kitchen table with the deliberate attention of a man who'd been around documents long enough to read what was under the language as well as in it. This is Pruitt, Hendricks said. The signatures Walsh and Morrison and 2 others. The signature is whoever Pruitt talked into signing, Hendricks said. He set the letter down. You know what this actually is, don't you? It's not about the supply contract. He doesn't care about your supply contract. He cares about Dawson's relationship with the bank, Garrett said. He cares about leverage, Hendricks said. He wants you to come to him, to have a conversation, to work something out. He looked at Garrett. And in that conversation, he will want you to send the woman back. The kitchen was warm. Hendricks' wife moved somewhere in the back of the house. That's what this is about, Garrett said. It's what it's always been about, Hendricks said. You embarrassed him at the station. You embarrassed him at the meeting. And every week she's on your ranch and things get better instead of worse, he's more embarrassed. He picked up the letter again. Dale Pruitt does not easily forgive the fact of being wrong. Garrett said, What would you do? Hendricks looked at him. I wouldn't have a conversation with him. And the supply contract? Talk to Briggs. He buys in volume from a supplier in Billings. He might be willing to add you to his order. It's not as convenient as Dawson, but it gets you through the winter. He folded the letter and handed it back. And the water rights. Show me what you've got. Garrett put Elias's records on the table. Hendricks read the first page, then the second. He read it the way he'd read the letter, carefully, with the attention of someone who knew what he was looking for. He said, without looking up, Who compiled this? Mabel's second boy, Elias. He's 13. Hendricks looked up. He looked back at the records. 13, he said. He's been doing it 2 years. Hendricks turned to the summary page. He read it twice. This is organized better than most legal filings I've seen. He looked at Garrett. If Walsh pushes the survey dispute to a formal review, this documentation puts you in a strong position. But it needs to be registered, filed with the county recorder, so there's an official record that predates any challenge. Can you help me do that? I can have it done by the end of the week, Hendricks said. I'll go with you to the recorder's office myself. He set the records down. You should know that doing this will make Pruitt move faster. He'll know you're not going to come have that conversation. I know, Garrett said. You're all right with that. I've been all right with a harder thing than Dale Pruitt before, Garrett said. Hendricks smiled briefly, in the way of a man who respects a plain answer. Bring me that boy's records tomorrow. We'll get them filed. Elias received the news that his records were going to be registered with the county with the specific expression of a person who has been working on something without knowing if it would ever be useful, and who finds the answer to that question somewhat overwhelming and does not intend to let it show. He sat very still at the kitchen table when Garrett told him. The full 2 years? He said. All of it. Hendricks says it's the strongest documentation he's seen for a water use claim. Elias looked at his notebook. He turned it over once in his hands. My father started the method, he said, for the second time since Garrett had known him. Not because he'd forgotten he'd said it, but because some things need to be said more than once to stay accurate. I know, Garrett said. He would have kept better records than me, Elias said. He was more organized. Garrett considered this. Maybe. But he's not here, and you are. And what you built is working. Elias set the notebook flat on the table. He put both hands on it, and the gesture was so uncharacteristically human, so much the gesture of someone holding on to something they'd built with their own hands, that Garrett found himself looking away for a moment, not because it made him uncomfortable, but because it was the kind of thing you didn't stare at. Mabel, at the stove, said nothing. She stirred whatever was in the pot and kept her back to the room and gave her son the space to feel what he was feeling without an audience. That, Garrett thought, was something. The real damage from the storm revealed itself in the week that followed, the way storm damage does. Not all at once, but in layers. The visible things first, then the things under the visible things. The east barn wall that Jonah had braced during the storm had held, but inspection showed that the underlying beam was cracked. Not broken, but cracked in a way that wouldn't survive another hard weather event without replacement. Jonah found it, reported it, and began the work of sourcing the right timber from the supply stack without being asked. He was 10 years old, and he went about it with the methodical patience of someone who'd learned that most things you take care of early don't become emergencies later. Garrett watched him work one afternoon. Not supervising, not helping, just watching. "How do you know how to do this?" he said. Jonah looked up from the beam he was measuring. "My father showed me some of it, the rest I figured out." "By breaking things first?" Jonah almost smiled. "Mostly, yes." "That's how everyone learns," Garrett said. "They just don't admit it." Jonah went back to his measuring. Then he said without looking up, "Are we staying?" Garrett was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. Jonah made a mark on the timber with a pencil stub. "Okay," he said. Just that. "Okay." With the particular brevity of a boy who had learned not to put too much weight on things until they were solid, and who, having been told a thing was solid, needed only one word to acknowledge it. Garrett went back inside. Set. The conflict with Pruitt moved the way Hendricks had predicted. Faster once the records were filed, and on a different front than the one Garrett had been watching. The front Pruitt chose was the one Garrett had not fully anticipated, which was the social one, and the specific vector was the other wives of the valley. The women of the Harwick ranching community were not a monolith. They were a collection of individual people with individual opinions who had been organized by social convention into a body that acted, in public, with a consensus they did not always actually share. But in public, the consensus carried weight, and the consensus Pruitt was cultivating, through his wife Agnes and Agnes's considerable network of the valley's opinion infrastructure, was the one about appearances. It arrived at the Holloway Ranch in the form of a visit. Agnes Pruitt came on a Thursday morning with Ellen Walsh and a woman named Doris Briggs, Callum Briggs's wife, which was a combination that struck Garrett as slightly alarming when Roy came to tell him that a wagon with 3 women had pulled up. He found Mabel in the kitchen as usual. "You have visitors," he said. She looked at him. "I heard the wagon." He didn't know what to say. What he wanted to say was something useful, and nothing useful was coming. "Should I?" he started. "No," she said. "I'll handle it." She straightened her apron. She looked at the kitchen, which was, as it always was, organized and purposeful and clean, in the particular way of a place that is used hard by competent people. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window over the sink for just a second. Then she went to the front door and opened it. Agnes Pruitt came in first, which was how Agnes always did things. She was a neat woman with precise manners and the specific graciousness of someone who had made a study of graciousness as a tool. Ellen Walsh came in after her with the slightly anxious energy of a woman who was here because she'd been brought, not because she decided to come. And Doris Briggs came in last, and Doris Briggs was something different from the other two, older, more direct, with a face that had been weathered by a life of working alongside her husband on land that didn't give anything easily. Mabel showed them into the kitchen and made coffee. She did this without any performance, just got the cups and the pot and set them on the table and sat across from the 3 women, like someone who knew exactly what this visit was about and had decided the most useful response to it was dignity. Agnes looked around the kitchen. Her eyes moved the way eyes do when they're looking for something to say, either something to praise, because she was here to be gracious, or something to fault, because she was here for a reason. The kitchen gave her very little to fault. "You've reorganized," Agnes said. "I find reorganizing helps me understand a space," Mabel said.
And you've been here. How long now? 5 weeks, Mabel said. Agnes nodded with the particular nod of someone recalibrating. Ellen Walsh said, Your children are settling well? They are, Mabel said. Thank you for asking. There was a silence. Doris Briggs drank her coffee and looked at Mabel with the direct look of someone who had decided to skip a step. My husband says your boy built the evidence that Garrett filed with the county recorder, Doris said. The water records. Elias, Mabel said. He's been keeping them for 2 years. Callum said they were thorough. He's a thorough child, Mabel said. Agnes said, with the very careful delicacy of someone carrying a message they've been instructed to deliver. Some of us, some people in the valley, have some concerns about the arrangement here, about whether it's... She stopped, started over. It's unusual. Most useful things are, Mabel said. Agnes looked at her. The graciousness slipped a fraction. Doris Briggs said, Agnes, just say the plain thing. Agnes looked at Doris, then, with the air of someone abandoning a strategy, she said, Some people think you're going to be a burden to Garrett, to the ranch, that you'll take more than you give. Do you think that? Mabel said. I don't know you, Agnes said, which was honest at least. No, Mabel said. You don't. She looked at her coffee cup and then at Agnes. Mrs. Pruitt, I have been doing heavy work since I was 9 years old. I raised 4 sons with almost no help after their father died, and I kept us housed and fed through 3 very difficult years. I am not easy to break, and I am not easy to burden. She paused. What I am is large, and I know that is what people see first, and I know some people decide what they think about me in the first 10 seconds, and they spend a long time afterward being certain they were right. She looked at Agnes steadily. I can't do anything about what people see first. I can only tell you what actually is. Agnes was quiet. Ellen Walsh, who had barely spoken, said quietly, What you did with those boys, raising them alone, that's not a small thing. No, Mabel said. It's not. Doris Briggs set down her cup. I'll tell you what I see when I look at this kitchen, she said. I see a ranch that's running better than it was 2 months ago. Callum's seen it. He said the hands eat well, the cattle count is up, the provisions are organized, and Garrett Holloway looks like a man who's sleeping full nights instead of half. She looked at Mabel. I've been in this kitchen twice before. It didn't look like this. Agnes was looking at the shelves, at the annotation in Mabel's handwriting on the provision ledger, at the organized row of preserved goods that had replaced the haphazard stacking Garrett had maintained for years. I see it too, Agnes said. The words came out slower than the others, like they'd taken a different route. Doris looked at her with a slight satisfaction. Agnes, Doris said, you should tell Dale that the women have seen the kitchen. Agnes looked at her. Something moved behind her eyes. I'll consider what to tell Dale, she said, with a dignity that was now doing something slightly different than it had been doing when she walked in. It wasn't performing. It was protecting. When they left, Mabel stood at the front window and watched the wagon until it was down the road. Garrett came in through the back and found her standing there. How did it go? He said. She turned. She was tired, not physically, but in the specific way of someone who'd just spent 40 minutes being measured by people who were not sure what measuring instrument to use. I don't know yet, she said. Ask me in a week. He looked at her. You all right? She thought about the question, not the social version of it, but the real one. I've done harder, she said. I know you have. She looked at him. That steadiness she had, that particular capacity for looking at someone without making the look into something it wasn't, was fully present, and he held it without looking away. Garrett, she said, if Pruitt keeps pushing, and he will, it's going to get harder before it gets easier. I know. And I need to know that you know why you're pushing back. Not just because the ranch is running well, not just because it's the sensible thing. She paused. Because if it gets hard enough, sensible is not going to be enough. He thought about the east pasture at 2 a.m. He thought about Nathan's voice saying you shouldn't be alone for this. He thought about Elias's records and Jonah's repaired wall and Micah's hawk in the crate and the way the kitchen felt in the evenings now with the lamp lit and the fire running and the sound of people who belonged there. I know why, he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. All right, she said.
She moved past him toward the kitchen. Supper's in an hour. He turned and watched her go. He thought about the letter he'd sent back to the agency. He thought about what Hendricks had said, and about what was coming, and about how most things that mattered didn't come cheap and didn't come smooth. Outside, the cold held its ground, and the mountains stood where they'd always stood, patient and specific, and the ranch settled into the long work of the evening with the sound of people doing what needed to be done. The week after Agnes Pruitt's visit to the kitchen passed without any visible change in the valley's social temperature, which Garrett had learned to read as the period before a thing became clear rather than evidence that nothing was happening. Briggs came by on Saturday with the answer on the supply question. He'd spoken to his contact in Billings, and yes, Garrett could be added to the consolidated order at a freight cost that was higher than Dawson, but manageable. Not comfortable. Manageable. Garrett shook his hand and said he'd take it, and Briggs said it was no trouble, and neither of them said anything about why it had become necessary because the reason was understood. The practical problem of winter provisions was solved. The other problems were still forming. On the following Monday, a man named Gerald Foss arrived at the ranch. Garrett didn't know Foss well. He was a Harwick man, had a small property east of town, did some surveying work on the side for the county. He'd done the original boundary survey for 2 of the properties in the valley. He arrived mid-morning in a wagon with a young assistant and a case of equipment, and he stopped in the yard and looked around with the methodical survey of a man assessing a job. Garrett came out. "Mr. Holloway," Foss said. He had a dry, precise manner, the kind that comes from years of working with measurements. "I've been engaged by the Walsh property to conduct a resurvey of the northern tributary boundary. I wanted to notify you as a professional courtesy, since the line in question borders your grazing rights." Garrett looked at him. He looked at the equipment case. "When?" Garrett said. "I'll begin Wednesday. The work should take 2 to 3 days depending on ground conditions." Foss paused. He had the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who was executing a task he hadn't been fully informed about the context of. "I understand there's a pending dispute regarding water access. I should tell you that I conduct surveys independently and report what I find." "I'm not questioning that," Garrett said. Foss nodded. He looked at the mountain line. "You have documentation of your current use pattern." "Filed with the county recorder last week." Foss blinked. Something in his expression adjusted. "I see." He looked at his assistant, who was studying the horizon with the careful non-expression of someone who knew when to be invisible. That will be relevant to the process." "I thought it might be," Garrett said. After Foss left, Garrett stood in the yard for a moment in the cold. Then he went inside and found Elias in the kitchen. "Walsh is having the boundary resurveyed," he said. Elias looked up from the table where he'd been working on his current weather records. "Starting Wednesday." "Yes." Elias was quiet. He turned his pencil over in his fingers once. "My records show consistent water usage on the north tributary from this property going back 22 months, including the dry summer when we documented that the flow stayed above the legal threshold for shared access." He set the pencil down. "The survey might move a line. It can't move the water." Garrett looked at him. "The water records and the survey are 2 different arguments," Elias said. "They can win one and still not have what they want." 17 words, 13 years old. Garrett had paid a lawyer in Helena 3 years ago to tell him something similar about a different piece of land, and the lawyer had taken 40 minutes and charged accordingly. "You understood that on your own," Garrett said. "My father lost a land claim," Elias said. "I paid attention." Nathan came to Garrett's study that same evening. He knocked, which he hadn't done before, had always just appeared in doorways and waited to be noticed. The knock was a small thing, and Garrett registered it without comment. "Come in," Garrett said. Nathan came in and stood near the desk. He had his hands in his coat pockets, which meant he was uncomfortable with something, because when Nathan was at ease, his hands were always doing something. "There's a situation," Nathan said. Garrett waited. "In town. Roy told me." Nathan looked at the wall to the left of Garrett's head rather than directly at him, which was the look of someone choosing words carefully. "Pruitt has been saying things about my mother, specifically." "What things?" That a woman like her has no business running a man's household, that she eats more than she contributes, that the only reason you keep her is because you're too soft or too... Nathan stopped. His jaw tightened. Roy said he stopped listening after the third sentence. He didn't tell me the rest. Garrett was quiet. I want to do something about it, Nathan said. His voice was even, but the evenness was doing work, was the controlled version of something that wanted to not be controlled. What did you have in mind? Garrett said. I don't know, something? Something like going to town and saying what you think. Nathan's eyes came back to him. Is that wrong? Garrett leaned back in his chair. He looked at the young man across from him. 16 years old, fully formed in his sense of what was right and wrong, with a temper that his mother had told him about at the very beginning, and with 3 years of protecting his family built into the shape of how he stood. It's not wrong, Garrett said. It might not be useful. He's saying those things in public. People are hearing them. Yes, and you're just... Nathan caught himself. He exhaled. I'm sorry, that's not... I didn't mean... You meant it, Garrett said. That's all right. Say what you meant. Nathan looked at him. Are you just going to let him do it? No, Garrett said. But there's a difference between responding and reacting. Reacting gives Pruitt something to point at. Responding gives him something to reckon with. He held Nathan's gaze. The survey starts Wednesday. The records are filed. Briggs has the supply arrangement covered. Every practical move Pruitt has made has been answered. He paused. What he's doing now with the talk is different. He's hoping someone on our side makes a move he can use. Nathan was still working through it. Garrett could see it. The best thing we can do right now, Garrett said, is keep running the ranch well. Every week that the ranch runs well is an argument Pruitt can't counter. He looked at Nathan. You understand that? Nathan was quiet for a moment. I understand it, he said. I don't like it. I know, Garrett said. Neither do I. Nathan turned to go. At the door he stopped. She doesn't know I came to you, he said. She'd tell me to leave it alone. She'd be right, Garrett said. Nathan looked at him. You're not going to tell her? Garrett said nothing. Nathan almost smiled. It was brief. Okay, he said, and left. Garrett sat with the lamp in the quiet for a while after that. So, Doris Briggs had told Agnes to tell Dale about the kitchen. What Agnes actually told Dale, nobody outside that household knew. But something shifted in the week following the visit. Not visibly, not in any way that could be pointed to, but Garrett noticed it in the grain of things. Agnes Pruitt stopped into the dry goods store on the same afternoon as Ellen Walsh, which was not unusual, but Ellen Walsh came out of the dry goods store with the expression of a woman who had heard something that had surprised her, and she drove her wagon past the Holloway Ranch Road that afternoon and slowed slightly before going on, which Doris Briggs's hired girl mentioned to Roy at the feed store, and Roy mentioned to Garrett. None of this was conclusive. All of it was weather, in the way Elias understood weather. Patterns that didn't mean anything in isolation, but assembled, over time, into something you could read. What Garrett could read was that the social ground was not as solid under Pruitt's position as it had been 6 weeks ago, and that the shift had come not from anything Garrett had said in public, but from Doris Briggs telling Agnes Pruitt to look at a kitchen. He found this simultaneously heartening and absurd. He mentioned neither feeling out loud. The offer arrived on a Thursday, 8 days after Foss began the survey. It came through an intermediary, a man named Cleet Alderson, who ran the only law office in Harwick and who visited people's properties when the matter was sensitive enough to warrant a personal visit rather than a letter. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his lap and a folded document in his coat. Mabel made coffee. She sat at the far end of the table and said nothing, and Garrett had not asked her to leave, and she had not offered to. Alderson laid out the document. Walsh was prepared to formally withdraw the survey challenge and release any claim on the North Tributary water access in exchange for a cash settlement, a number that represented roughly what the legal proceedings would cost both parties, and a written acknowledgement from the Holloway Ranch that the boundary line as currently surveyed would not be contested. Garrett looked at the number. That's Walsh's number or Pruitt's number, he said. Alderson cleared his throat. The offer comes from the Walsh property. That's not what I asked. Alderson was quiet for a moment. He was a precise man, a careful man, and he had the look of someone delivering a message he hadn't written and wasn't sure he'd have written the same way. I'm told the offer reflects several parties' interests, Alderson said. Garrett looked at the document. The number was not impossible. It was the kind of number that would tighten the winter budget past comfortable but not past manageable. He said, "And if I don't take it?" The survey findings support a reclassification of the tributary access rights. Walsh's legal position, combined with the survey, would likely result in a formal proceeding in the spring. Alderson paused. Formal proceedings are expensive and uncertain. My water documentation is filed with the county. I'm aware. Alderson folded his hands on the table. The survey establishes a boundary. The water records establish use. In a formal proceeding, the question would be which argument the court finds more compelling. He looked at Garrett directly. I cannot tell you the answer to that question. Garrett looked at the number on the paper. Mabel said, from the end of the table, Mr. Alderson. Alderson looked at her. The water records that were filed last week, she said. Were they filed with supporting documentation of the survey as it currently stands? The one that predates Walsh's challenge? Alderson blinked. Yes, I believe so. The filing would include the existing survey reference. So the current survey record forms part of the foundation of the water rights claim. Alderson looked at her, then back at Garrett. That's a reasonable interpretation, yes. Which means, Mabel said, that accepting the boundary line as currently surveyed in exchange for withdrawal of the water challenge costs Mr. Holloway nothing he doesn't already have. The kitchen was very quiet. Alderson looked at the document. He looked at Garrett. His expression had the quality of a man revising his assessment of a conversation. Garrett looked at Mabel. She was looking at her coffee cup with the expression of a woman who had said what she had to say and was now waiting to see what happened next. Garrett looked at Alderson. Tell them I'll accept the boundary acknowledgement and withdraw my counter-survey request. The cash settlement is declined. Alderson's eyebrows rose slightly. They may not. The boundary acknowledgement costs me nothing and closes the survey question, Garrett said. The cash payment would be an admission that there was something to settle. There wasn't. Tell them that. Alderson folded the document. He put it back in his coat. I'll relay the response, he said. He left. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Garrett said, How did you know about the survey reference in the filing? Mabel looked at him. Hendricks mentioned it when he came by last week. He said the filing incorporated the existing survey record as baseline. She paused. I listen when people talk about important things. I know you do, Garrett said. She picked up her coffee. Was that the right answer, to decline the payment? Yes, Garrett said. Taking the money would have looked like we had a weak position. We don't. You're certain? Elias's records are 2 years of consistent documentation. Walsh and Pruitt built their challenge on a survey that was always going to find what they told it to find. But a survey can't change the record of who's been using the water and how. He looked at the door. Alderson had gone out. Pruitt wanted a negotiation. He got a refusal. Those are different things. Mabel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, He's not going to stop. No, Garrett said, but he's running out of practical moves. What's left is the personal kind. She looked at him. The talk? Yes. She nodded. She stood up and went back to the stove. The personal kind of move arrived that same week, and it came from a direction Garrett hadn't fully prepared for. The boarding house offer for Mabel. It didn't come from Pruitt directly. Pruitt was smarter than that. It came from a woman named Helen Carver, who owned the most established boarding house in Harwick, and who had a long-standing reputation for running a clean operation with good food. Helen Carver was a businesswoman, not a social schemer, and the offer she made was entirely genuine in its terms. She came to the ranch on a Friday afternoon and asked for Mabel by name, and Garrett, who was in the barn when she arrived, came out to find the two women already talking on the porch. He stopped at a distance and went back to the barn. He did not listen. He told himself he was not listening. He worked on the harness rack for 40 minutes with the particular focus of someone applying extra effort to a thing that doesn't require that much effort. When Helen Carver's wagon had gone, he gave it another 10 minutes and then went inside. Mabel was at the kitchen table. She had a piece of paper in front of her and she was looking at it, and she looked up when he came in. You saw her wagon, she said. Yes. She offered me the head cook position at Carver House, Mabel said. Separate quarters for me and the boys, steady wage. March through October contract with right of first renewal. Garrett sat down. He looked at the table. That's a good offer, he said. It is, she said. Carver House has a solid reputation. She had good things to say about the kitchen and the staff. Mabel looked at the paper. She'd heard about the bread receipts I gave to Margaret Briggs. And Roy apparently… She paused. Roy apparently told someone in town about the biscuits, and it got around. Garrett said nothing. She needs an answer by the end of the month, Mabel said. He looked at the lamp on the table. The flame was very small and very steady. What are you thinking? He said. Mabel was quiet for a moment. I'm thinking that it's a good offer, she said. I'm thinking that it solves problems I've been carrying for 3 years. Stable income, stable housing, my boys in one place for more than 6 months. She looked at him. I'm thinking it's everything I came west looking for. It is, he said. And I'm thinking that's not the whole of what I'm thinking, she said. He looked at her. Nathan told a joke at supper last Thursday, she said. Did you notice? I noticed. He hasn't done that in 3 years. She set the paper down. Elias has been sleeping better. I hear him in the morning. Before, he used to be up before 4 every night. Since we've been here, he sleeps until 5:30. That's not nothing, Garrett. That's 2 hours of sleep for a 13-year-old brain that hasn't rested properly since his father died. She said his name without appearing to notice she'd said it. He noticed. Jonah asked me last week if Mr. Holloway would teach him how to read a land map, she said. Not a general question, specifically you. He asked if you would. She looked at him. That child has not asked an adult for anything in 2 years. He waits to be told. He works on what he's given and asks for nothing extra. He asked. Garrett's throat was tight in a way he didn't have a good explanation for. And Micah, she said. Micah has not had a nightmare in 3 weeks. He used to have them twice a week. The lamp flame moved, settled. So what are you telling me? Garrett said. His voice came out quieter than he'd intended. She looked at him with that steadiness, the one he'd been watching since the train platform, the one that wasn't performing anything. I'm telling you what's true, she said, and I'm asking you what you think I should do. He was quiet for a moment. I think, he said slowly, that if Carver House is what you want, it's a good answer. It's a fair answer. You'd run that kitchen inside of a month and you know it. He looked at the lamp. And I think if you stay here, what you're building is different, harder in some ways, and not guaranteed in any of the ways the boarding house offer is guaranteed. What's not guaranteed, she said. He looked at her. I'm not a simple man to work with, he said. I've been told before, that I don't say enough, that I let things sit too long before I address them, that I assume people know what I'm thinking because I know what I'm thinking. He paused. I'm also told my winters are hard. I've been through hard winters, she said. I know, but mine are mine, and that's different from someone else's hard. She considered this seriously, the way she considered most things. Not performing consideration, actually doing it. What else? He was quiet. Then he said, I don't want you to go. It sat there. She looked at him. Her expression was not surprised. It was not overwhelmed. It had the quality of someone who had expected a door might be there and was now looking at the fact of it directly. You need to say more than that, she said. He knew. He'd been trying to get to the more than that for a week and had been routing around it. When I drove to the station in November, he said, I had a list in my coat pocket. Everything on it was practical. Everything I'd been running this ranch on for 6 years was practical. The right equipment, the right hands, the right provisions, work the problem in front of you and don't borrow trouble. He looked at his hands on the table. And then you stepped off that train and your boys stepped down behind you. And within a week I was sleeping better and eating better and I was thinking differently. About the ranch. About what I was doing it for. He looked up. I hadn't thought about what I was doing it for in a long time. Mabel was very still. I'm not asking you to make a decision about something that hasn't had time to be a thing yet, he said. I know it's been 6 weeks. I know that's not long enough to be certain about anything serious. He held her gaze. But I know what this place has been like since you arrived. And I know what it was like before. And I'd be lying if I said those two things didn't matter to me in a way that's past practical. The kitchen was very quiet. Mabel looked at the paper in front of her. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, Jonah fixed the pantry door last Tuesday. Garrett blinked. The hinge he repaired.
It was a good repair, but he used a screw that was slightly too short for the wood thickness. I noticed it 2 days later. I mentioned it to him. She looked at Garrett. He went back and replaced the screw. Didn't make a thing of it. Just fixed what was wrong. She paused. He's never done that before. Admitted a mistake and gone back to it. He would do good work and then defend the work even when he knew it wasn't right, because he'd learned that admitting a mistake meant being dismissed. She looked at the paper. He's only had 6 weeks here,
And he already knows he won't be dismissed. Garrett didn't say anything. That's what you built, she said. You built that in 6 weeks, by the way you talked to him, by the way you paid attention. He was looking at her. I need you to understand what you have here, she said, because I need to know that you know it. Not just that the ranch is running well, that these boys… She stopped. Something moved through her face quickly and was contained. These boys have been through enough. And if they're going to stay somewhere, I need to know it's somewhere real, not somewhere that's practical. It's real, Garrett said. She looked at him. Mabel, he said. I don't know how to say it better than that. It's real. She picked up the paper. She held it for a moment, and then she set it back down without folding it. I'll write to Mrs. Carver, she said. I'll thank her for the offer. He looked at her. You're sure? I'm not sure of anything, she said. I haven't been sure of anything since my husband died, but I know what's real when I see it, and I'm not in the habit of walking away from real things. She stood. I need to start supper. He stood too. Mabel, he said. She turned. Thank you, he said. Not for the supper, not for the decision. She understood what he meant, and he knew she understood, which was the first time he'd known that about a thing he'd said to her. She nodded. She went to the stove. The following Monday brought 2 things. The first was Alderson's return with a revised document from Walsh. They had accepted the boundary acknowledgement without the cash settlement. The survey challenge was formally withdrawn. The water rights question was closed. Garrett signed the document at the kitchen table with Hendricks present as witness, and Hendricks shook his hand and said, "Well done," in the tone of a man who knew what had actually happened and how it had happened. And then he left, and the thing was done. The second thing was Nathan. He came to Garrett in the barn that afternoon, not knocking this time, just appearing the way he'd started doing again, which Garrett took as a return to the normal mode. I heard about the Walsh settlement, Nathan said. Closed this morning, Garrett said. Nathan stood with his hands in his pockets. He looked at the horse Garrett was brushing. He said, I owe you an apology. Garrett looked at him. I came to you 3 weeks ago and basically implied you weren't doing enough, Nathan said. About Pruitt, about the things he was saying. He looked at the horse. You were doing exactly what needed to be done and I didn't see it because I was too close to it. He paused. I'm sorry. Garrett kept brushing. He thought about what to say. You were protecting your mother, he said. That's not wrong. The way I did it wasn't right. No, but the instinct was. He set the brush down and looked at Nathan directly. You've been doing that job for 3 years, looking out for them. You don't switch that off in 6 weeks. Nathan looked at the ground. She told me to let it alone. Pruitt. I didn't listen. You listened enough to come to me instead of going to town. Nathan looked up. That's not nothing, Garrett said. That's you trusting someone else to carry part of it. That's not easy to do when you've been doing it alone. Nathan was quiet. He had the expression of someone who'd been given a way of looking at something they'd only been able to see one way before. Can I tell you something? Nathan said. Go ahead. I used to think, he started and then stopped and reorganized. My father was a good man, a really good man, and after he died, I told myself that what I had to do was be him, be what he was, step in where he'd been. He looked at the horse. And I couldn't, obviously. I was 13 and I couldn't do what a grown man with 20 years of experience could do. But I tried, and when I failed at it, I just tried harder. And then I stopped telling anyone when I failed because it seemed like admitting it meant failing the whole thing. Garrett listened. Since we came here, Nathan said, I've stopped trying to be him. He said it with a slight bewilderment, like he'd noticed it but hadn't understood it yet. I'm just trying to be good at what's in front of me. The fence work, the cattle, whatever you need. He looked at Garrett. And I fail at things, and I say so, and it's not… He stopped again. Nobody dismisses you for it, Garrett said. Yeah. They were quiet for a moment. Garrett picked the brush back up. Your father built something good in you, he said. All four of you. That's his work. You can stop trying to be him and still carry what he left. Nathan looked at the side of the stall for a long time. Yeah, he said. His voice was slightly unsteady, and he was working to steady it, which Garrett respected without mentioning. Go check the east water trough, Garrett said. Temperature's dropping again tonight. Nathan went. What? The hawk flew. It was a Tuesday, the last week of January, and Micah had been checking the crate every morning with the patient persistence of a child who understood that some things took the time they took. The wing had healed. Not perfectly. The primary feathers on the right side sat slightly wrong. But it had healed enough. Garrett was in the yard when Micah came out of the house with the crate, and he stopped what he was doing and watched. Mabel came to the kitchen window. She stood there. Micah set the crate down in the yard, away from the barn, away from the tree line, in an open space. He undid the latch. He opened the crate door. He stepped back. The hawk sat in the crate for a moment. It turned its head once, and then again. It looked at the open door and then at the sky, which was the particular flat white of a January afternoon with the sun somewhere behind the clouds doing minimal work. Then it stepped to the crate opening, spread its wings once, the right one sitting slightly wrong, but working, and went. It didn't spiral dramatically. It flew low and direct toward the tree line, strong wing beats, and then it was gone into the pines. Micah stood in the yard and watched where it had been. Garrett watched Micah. The boy's face was doing several things at once, the joy of it, and the loss of it, and the specific satisfaction of the effort having been worth something, all of it present at the same time without resolving into any single emotion. After a while, Micah turned and looked at Garrett. It made it, he said. It made it, Garrett said. Micah looked back at the tree line. Do you think it'll be okay? Out there? Garrett thought about this honestly. I don't know, he said. The wing's not perfect, but it flew strong, and it knows what to do out there. Micah thought about that. We gave it the best chance we could. We did. Micah picked up the empty crate. He carried it back toward the barn without looking back at the tree line. Garrett looked at the kitchen window. Mabel was still there. She was watching her youngest son carry the crate across the yard, and her face had the look of someone watching something they'd been hoping for without letting themselves count on it. She looked up and found Garrett watching her. Neither of them said anything. She moved away from the window, back to whatever she'd been doing, and Garrett stood in the cold yard for another moment and thought about the hawk flying with its imperfect wing toward the tree line, doing the thing it was built to do, in a world that hadn't made it easy. He thought about Mabel's letter to Helen Carver, which had been sent and acknowledged, the offer declined with thanks. He thought about the settlement document with his signature on it. He thought about Elias's records, filed and formal and permanent, and Nathan sleeping without the weight of the entire family on his 16-year-old chest, and Jonah replacing the screw he'd gotten wrong, and Micah standing in the yard watching a hawk find its wings. He thought about 6 weeks, which was not very long, and about what could grow in 6 weeks when the ground was right and someone was paying attention. He went inside. The kitchen was warm. Mabel was at the stove. The late afternoon light came through the window and lay across the floor in the particular way it had in January, low and long and specific to this kitchen and no other. He sat down at the table. She set a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked. He wrapped his hands around it. Outside, Pruitt still had opinions. Walsh had been told no. The valley still had people who made up their minds in the first 10 seconds and spent a long time afterward being certain. But in this kitchen, in the low winter light, with the fire running steady and the sound of the boys in the back of the house and the coffee warm between his hands, Garrett Holloway felt something he recognized, finally, for what it was. Not comfort, not the resolution of a problem. Something that was going to take longer than 6 weeks and would not be smooth and would have hard winters in it and practical problems and silences that needed breaking and things that needed saying that were difficult to say. Something real. He drank his coffee. Mabel stirred the pot. The kitchen held them both, and the afternoon went on, and outside the cold kept its grip on the valley, but in here the fire was doing what fire does when someone has built it right and kept it fed. February came in quietly after the noise of January, the way things sometimes do when they've already said the hard thing and are waiting to see if it lands. The water rights settlement had closed. The supply arrangement with Briggs's Billings contact was running smoothly. at a higher cost than before, but without the uncertainty of Dawson's goodwill. Elias's records were filed and permanent. The boundary question was done. What remained was Pruitt, and Pruitt remained the way a season remains, not as a single event, but as a condition. He had not made another formal move. He had not needed to, because the informal moves were still working their slow erosion through the Valley's opinion infrastructure, through the conversations at Doyle's Hardware and the Merchants Association dinners, and the places where people said things without quite saying them. Garrett knew this. Mabel knew it better. She knew it because she was the subject of it in a way that Garrett was adjacent to but not inside of. The talk about Garrett was that he'd made a poor decision. The talk about Mabel was something else. The kind of talk that attaches to a person and follows them and wears a different face depending on who's doing it and what they want from it. She had been through versions of this talk in every town they'd landed in over 3 years. She knew its texture. She knew how to carry herself through it without letting it reshape her. But she also knew, with the honesty she applied to most things, that it cost something every time. She was in the kitchen on a Wednesday morning, working through the provision ledger and the week's meal planning, when Garrett came in from the barn earlier than usual and stood near the door without sitting down. She looked up. "Pruitt's called a meeting," he said. "Special session of the Cattlemen's Association, Thursday evening." She set her pen down. "What's the stated topic?" she said. "Community standards in ranch operations." He said it without inflection. "Which is not a topic that has ever been on the agenda before." She looked at the ledger, then at him. "What do you think he's going to do?" "I think he's going to push for a formal resolution," Garrett said. "Something the association can put its name to that says a certain kind of arrangement isn't acceptable in this valley. Something that doesn't name anyone specifically, but that everyone in the room knows is about this ranch." "Can he do that? Is there any authority?" "The association doesn't have legal authority over how I run my ranch," Garrett said. "But it has social authority. If he gets a formal statement out of that room, he controls the language. He controls what the thing is called." He looked at her. "And then it stops being about his opinion and starts being about the valley's opinion." Mabel was quiet for a moment. "Are you going?" she said. "Yes." "Alone?" He looked at her. There was a question underneath that question, and they both understood it. "Briggs said he'll be there," Garrett said. "Hendricks, too. They're not going to let it run without pushback." "That's not what I asked," she said. He sat down then. He put his hat on the table and looked at her directly. "I'd like you to come with me." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to defend yourself," he said. "You don't owe that room anything. But I think there's a difference between Briggs and Hendricks speaking up for how the ranch is running and the woman who's actually running it being present to be looked at." He paused. "Pruitt's been making you a story. I'd like to make you a person." She thought about this. "You understand," she said carefully, "that walking into that room is not a small thing. Not for me. Not with what I look like and what they've been saying. And I know," he said, "and you're asking anyway." "I'm asking, not telling. If you say no, we don't go." She looked at the ledger, at the week's numbers, at the provision management that had taken a chaotic operation and made it functional and then made it efficient. She thought about 3 years of towns where she'd kept her head down and done good work, and still been made into a story that had nothing to do with the work. She thought about Doris Briggs saying, "Look at this kitchen." "What time?" she said. 7. She nodded. "I'll need the boys settled first. I'll tell Nathan." Nathan's response to being told he'd be in charge Thursday evening was to ask, with the specific directness he'd developed over the past 2 months, whether Garrett thought it would come to anything serious at the meeting. "It might," Garrett said. "And you're taking my mother." "She agreed to come." Nathan looked at him. He had that evaluating quality. Not suspicious, just thorough. "She didn't tell you to go alone and handle it?" "She did not." Nathan seemed to file this. "Okay," he said. "I'll handle the evening here." He said it the way he said most things now. Not as a boy stepping into a man's role, but as a person who'd been given responsibility and intended to carry it because he'd chosen to, not because there was nobody else. The distinction was small on the outside and enormous on the inside, and Garrett had watched it develop over 10 weeks the way you watch a fence line strengthen. Gradually, and then it's just solid. "Nathan," Garrett said. "Yeah." "Whatever happens Thursday, the ranch keeps going Friday." Nathan looked at him. I know that. I know you know it. I'm saying it anyway. Nathan almost smiled. You do that, he said. Say things I already know. Someone has to, Garrett said. What? Thursday was cold and clear, which meant the roads were hard and the drive to Harwick was fast, and the sky was the specific black of a winter night, with no clouds to hold any warmth. Garrett drove and Mabel sat beside him, and they were mostly quiet on the road, which was not an uncomfortable quiet. About 3 miles out, she said, My husband used to say that the only opinion that mattered was the one you carried about yourself. He said it like it was settled. Was he right? Garrett said. Partly, she said. The part he left out is that other people's opinions have practical consequences. They affect what work you can get and where you can live and how your children are treated. She looked at the dark road ahead. Carrying yourself right doesn't protect you from that. No, he said, it doesn't. But it means you're still yourself at the end of it, she said, and that's not nothing. He drove for a while. What are you going to do when we walk in? She said. Sit down, he said. Listen to what he says, and then tell them what's true. That's all? That's usually enough with the right people in the room. He paused. And if it's not enough with this room, then the room has already decided, and nothing I say changes it. She absorbed this. You're more at peace with the possibility of losing than I expected, she said. I'm not at peace with it, he said, but I've made my decisions already. I signed the letter back to the agency. I settled the water rights on the right terms. I kept the ranch running. He looked at the road. What happens in that room tonight either confirms those decisions or it doesn't. Either way, the decisions are made. She looked at the side of his face in the dark. Garrett, she said. Yeah, I don't want to be the reason this valley turns on you. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're not the reason for anything except the ranch running better than it has in years. What Pruitt does with that is his choice, not yours. She said nothing. Mabel, he said. She looked at him. Stop trying to make yourself smaller than the situation, he said. You don't do that in the kitchen. Don't do it tonight. She was very still for a moment. All right, she said. They drove the last 3 miles without talking, and the town came up in the dark with its lit windows, and Garrett turned the wagon toward Doyle's. The room was fuller than the regular meetings. That was the first thing Garrett noticed. Men who hadn't been at the November meeting were here tonight, which meant the special session had been promoted beyond the usual membership, which meant Pruitt had been working the invitation list with intention. There were perhaps 22 men in the room. Briggs was there, near the center. Hendricks was near the back wall, standing, which was where he stood when he intended to speak. Roy had come, which Garrett hadn't expected, and Roy was standing near the door with the expression of a man who had decided to be present for something without being entirely sure what it was going to be. When Garrett came through the door with Mabel behind him, the room changed. Not dramatically, not with any loud reaction. It changed the way a room changes when something unexpected walks in. A slight shift in posture, eyes moving and then correcting, the sound of a room rearranging its attention. Pruitt was at the front. He saw them. His face did something disciplined and controlled, and he managed to keep the control, but Garrett had been watching Pruitt's face for months now, and he caught the fraction of a second before the control arrived. Garrett walked to a pair of chairs in the middle of the room and sat down. Mabel sat beside him. The room settled. Pruitt called the meeting to order. He was skilled at this. Garrett had always acknowledged, privately, that Dale Pruitt was a skilled man in a room. He knew how to read an audience, how to pace a statement, how to make his position feel like common sense instead of preference. He opened with ranching concerns that had nothing to do with the real topic, spring water table projections, a proposal about cooperative road maintenance that he'd tabled 3 meetings ago. He spent 12 minutes on these things, which was 12 minutes of everyone in the room knowing what the real topic was and waiting for it. Then he said, There's a secondary matter I want to put to the association formally tonight. It concerns the standards we hold ourselves to as a community of ranchers and what we owe each other in terms of maintaining the character of this valley. Garrett said nothing. Mabel said nothing. Pruitt said, It has come to my attention that certain arrangements in the valley have created a situation that a number of members find concerning. Specifically, arrangements that blur the line between professional and personal relationships in ways that reflect poorly on all of us. that create an impression, to anyone looking at this valley from outside, that we are not careful about. Dale, Hendricks said from the back wall. Pruitt stopped. Say the specific thing, Hendricks said. We've been sitting here 20 minutes. Say what you're actually saying. The room was very quiet. Pruitt looked at Hendricks. Then he looked at the center of the room where Garrett and Mabel were sitting. All right, Pruitt said. He dropped the careful language like a coat he'd decided was too warm. I am saying that the arrangement at the Holloway Ranch, a widow woman, 4 children, an unmarried rancher, does not meet the standard of what this community should consider acceptable. I am saying that it creates talk, that it creates questions, and that as an association, we have both the right and the responsibility to say so formally. The room was still. Garrett said, "What questions?" Pruitt looked at him. You said it creates questions, Garrett said. What questions specifically? Pruitt's jaw tightened slightly. Questions about judgment, about what kind of operation. My operation, Garrett said, has produced more cattle per acre this winter than it has in 4 years. My provision losses to rot and spoilage are down by more than half. My ranch hands have stayed through the worst weather of the season, without complaint, and without losing a single head of cattle in either of the 2 storms we've had. He looked at Pruitt. What question does that raise? I'm not talking about cattle numbers. Then what are you talking about? Garrett said. Because you said this was about ranch operations and community standards. Tell me which standard I've failed to meet. Pruitt looked at the room. He was looking for the consensus he'd built, checking whether it was still where he'd left it. Some faces gave it back to him. Others were doing what Hendricks's face was doing, which was waiting. You brought a woman into your home, Pruitt said. A woman who does not represent the kind of... Her name is Mabel Ashcroft, Garrett said. For the second time in this valley, he said it to Dale Pruitt in a room with other people in it. She has been working my ranch for 11 weeks. She is the reason my operation is running at a level you have not seen from any property in this valley in recent memory. And what you are trying to say, because you won't say it plainly, is that you don't like what she looks like. The room breathed. Pruitt's face went through something. That is not... It is, said Doris Briggs. Everyone looked at her. She was sitting beside Callum with her hands in her lap and her face wearing the flat certainty of a woman who had been listening to this long enough. I went to that kitchen, Doris said. Agnes and Ellen and I. We went because you asked us to, Dale, and I know why you asked us to, and I'm going to tell this room what we found. She looked around at the men. We found a kitchen that runs better than any ranch kitchen in this valley. We found a woman who manages provisions, tracks expenses, prepares food that has kept 7 ranch hands working longer hours with fewer complaints, and does it all in conditions that most people wouldn't tolerate for a week. She looked at Pruitt. And then I'm going to tell you what we did not find. We did not find anything that justifies a single thing you've been saying about her for 11 weeks. The room was very quiet. Agnes Pruitt was sitting near the front. She was looking at the floor. Pruitt said, Doris, this isn't... I'm not finished, Doris said. The bread receipts she gave me. I've made them twice. My husband says they're the best thing I've served since we've been married. And Callum is not a man who says that about food. She looked at Mabel. I'm sorry it took me this long to say any of this in public. Mabel looked at her steadily. Thank you, she said. It was simple and it was real. Hendricks said from the back, I'd like to call the question on whether this association has any standing to pass a formal resolution about how a private rancher manages his own property. A man named Forsyth, who was a lawyer by training and a rancher by choice, said, It doesn't. The association has no authority over private employment arrangements or household composition. It never has. Pruitt said, The association has a responsibility to roads and water tables and cooperative grazing arrangements, Forsyth said. It has no authority over Mrs. Ashcroft or any other employee of a member's ranch. A resolution of that nature would be unenforceable and frankly embarrassing. The room had shifted. Garrett could feel it the way you feel a wind change, not in one direction but in a general movement that suddenly has a different origin. Pruitt knew it too. He stood at the front of the room with the proposal he'd come with turning to something else in his hands, and the room that had been his room for years doing what rooms do when the consensus has moved. He said, I am putting the motion on the floor. Forsyth said, "I'll call for a second." No one seconded. The silence ran for 5 seconds. 8, 12. Roy at the door was looking at the floor with the expression of a man working very hard not to show what his face was doing. Pruitt said, "The motion fails for lack of second." He sat down. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes on water table projections and road maintenance, and then it adjourned and people stood and put on coats, and the room did what it does when the thing everyone came for is finished, dispersed into smaller conversations, the specific gravity of the event breaking into fragments. Doris Briggs came to Mabel before they'd gotten to the door. "Come to dinner," she said. "Saturday. Bring the boys." Mabel looked at her. "That's kind of you?" "It's not kindness," Doris said. "Callum wants to talk to Elias about the spring weather patterns. He's been watching the East Ridge drainage, and he says your boy's methods are better than anything he's worked out himself." She paused. "Also, I want to see if you'll teach Margaret the pull-apart loaf in person. She's been following the written receipt and something's still wrong." Mabel almost smiled. "She's probably not resting the dough long enough." "That's what I told her," Doris said. They shook hands. It was brief and practical and more meaningful than something longer would have been. On the way out, Garrett passed Pruitt standing near the wall. Pruitt looked at him. His face had the look of a man at the end of a long effort, recalibrating. Garrett stopped. He thought about what to say. He thought about all the moves Pruitt had made, the station, the meetings, the merchants, the survey, the social campaign through Agnes and the Valley Wives. All of it. "Dale," he said, "I don't have any quarrel with you." Pruitt looked at him. "I never did," Garrett said. "You made it one. That was your choice." He paused. "I'd like it to be done." Pruitt was quiet for a moment. "Your operation," he said finally. He said it without the earlier gloss, just the words. "It's running well." "It is." Pruitt looked at the far wall. Something moved through his face that was hard to name. Not defeat exactly, because Pruitt was not a man who processed defeat straightforwardly, but something in the territory of reassessment. A man looking at a position he'd held and finding it less solid than he'd thought. "Agnes said the kitchen was impressive," he said. He said it like someone reading from a report. Factual. Not generous, but not dishonest. "It is," Garrett said. Pruitt nodded, once. And then he walked away, and Garrett let him go. And that was the end of it. Not the dramatic end. Not the collapse of a man who'd been proven wrong. Just the quiet conclusion of something that had used up its energy and had nowhere left to go. The drive home was different from the drive in. The silence was the same in its form, but different in its weight. It sat lighter. Or maybe it sat more honestly. Not the quiet of two people preparing for something, but the quiet of two people who'd been through something and were on the other side of it. About halfway home, Mabel said, "Doris Briggs?" "Yeah," Garrett said. "I didn't expect that." "I did," he said. "A little, after she came to the kitchen." Mabel was quiet for a moment. She apologized for taking so long. She meant it. "I know she did." She looked at the dark road. It's an unusual thing, being apologized to genuinely." She said it without bitterness, just as an observation about how rare the experience was. Most people who've been unfair to you don't apologize. They just stop being unfair, and that's the best you get. "She's a good woman," Garrett said. "She is." Mabel was quiet for another mile. "What did you say to Pruitt at the end?" "I told him I didn't have a quarrel with him, that I wanted it done." She turned and looked at him. "And?" "He said the kitchen was impressive," Agnes told him. She was very still for a moment. Then she made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite not one. "Agnes Pruitt told Dale Pruitt the kitchen was impressive." "That's what he said." She shook her head slowly. "I could not have predicted that." "Neither could I," he said. She turned back to the road. After a moment she said, "It's not over. Not entirely. He'll recalibrate. In 6 months he'll have a new angle on something." "Probably," Garrett said. "You're not worried about that." "I'm not going to run my ranch in anticipation of Dale Pruitt's next move," he said. "I'm going to run it right. If he comes at it again, I'll deal with it then." She was quiet. He said, "Are you worried about it?" She thought honestly. "Less than I was," she said. "I've been watching what happens when you just keep doing the work. The Briggses, Hendricks, Forsyth calling the legal question, Even Walsh backing down. She paused. I've spent 3 years trying to be invisible enough that people would stop finding reasons to push back, trying to take up less room. She looked at the dark mountains. You didn't try to be invisible, you just kept going, and eventually the room had to look at what was actually there. You did that too, he said. I was in that room tonight, she said. I showed up. You've been showing up every day for 11 weeks. She looked at him. So have you, she said. For all of us. He kept his eyes on the road. Garrett, she said. Yeah. I wrote to my sister last week, she said. She's in Kansas. I told her where we were. He waited. I told her it was good, Mabel said. I haven't told her anything was good in 3 years. He drove for a while. I'm glad, he said. And he meant it with all the simplicity of someone who doesn't have a more complicated way to say a true thing. Spring came the way it comes in that valley. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in stages that kept reversing themselves and then advancing further than before. March brought a thaw, and then a freeze, and then a real thaw. And the creek ran strong, and the ground softened, and the cattle came out of their winter condition thin but alive, and the work of spring began. It was different from the previous springs Garrett had run on that ranch. Not better in every particular. There were still mornings where everything went wrong before noon, still cattle that behaved like cattle, still weather that changed its mind. But the shape of the days was different. Jonah had learned to read a land map over the winter. He now kept his own diagram of the property, with notations about the fence line condition and the drainage patterns, cross-referenced with Elias's weather records. He was 10 years old, and his map was more current than any record Garrett had maintained. He never said this, because Jonah rarely made comparisons out loud, but Garrett knew it and found it more amusing than anything else. Elias had begun teaching Roy how to read the basic weather indicators: cloud formation, wind behavior, the creek sounds that corresponded to pressure changes. Roy was a willing student and not a quick one, and their working sessions had the particular texture of a precise 13-year-old trying very hard not to be impatient with an earnest 22-year-old. It was working, slowly. Nathan had stopped carrying himself like a man preparing for the floor to give way. This was the change Mabel saw most clearly and said nothing about most carefully, because it was the kind of thing that needed to happen without being remarked on. Nathan had been braced for 3 years, shoulders set, jaw tight, always half a thought ahead of the next problem. And the bracing had become the way he moved through the world. It was loosening, not gone, not resolved into some easy, uncomplicated version of a teenager. He still watched the room when he entered it, still noted exits and complications. But he also sat down for meals without looking like he was prepared to stand up again. And he laughed when something was funny, without the slight delay that had been there before. And one afternoon in March, he sat on the porch in the thin spring sun and did nothing for 20 minutes, just sat. And Mabel watched him from the kitchen window and did not call him to do anything. Micah turned 7 in March. He had become a fixture of the ranch in the specific way that small children become fixtures when the adults around them are too busy to carefully manage their access to things. He was in the barn, in the kitchen, in the yard, in Elias's company when Elias permitted it, and out of it when he didn't. He had opinions about everything and shared them without invitation, and the hands had developed a tolerance for his presence that had somewhere along the line become genuine affection, which Micah had not engineered and was not aware of. Roy made him a birthday cake. Roy was not a baker and had clearly asked Mabel for assistance, which Mabel had clearly provided while maintaining the fiction that Roy had done it himself, because Micah was 7 and the cake was for him and the truth of who made it was less important than the fact of it. Micah ate 2 pieces and declared it the best cake he'd ever had. Roy looked like he'd been given something. The formal question, the one that had been sitting between Garrett and Mabel since the evening with the lamp and the agency letter and the words, "I don't want you to go," came to a point on an April evening. Not dramatically. Quietly. The way things come to a point between people who've been moving toward each other slowly and know it. They were in the kitchen after supper. The boys were in the back. The hands were in the bunkhouse. The fire was low and the lamp was lit, and it was the particular hour that kitchen is built for. After the work and before the sleep. When there's no task to focus on, and the room just holds you. Mabel was at the table with her provision planning. Garrett was sitting across from her looking at nothing specific. He said, I want to ask you something. She looked up. And I want to do it right this time, he said, which means I'm asking, not deciding, and then telling you after. She set her pen down. He looked at her. I'd like this to be permanent, he said. You and the boys. I'd like it to be something real and documented, not an arrangement. He paused. I'd like to marry you if you're willing, but I'm saying it as a question, not an assumption. She was still. I know this is fast, he said. In terms of how people usually count time, it's been 5 months. It has, she said, and I know I'm not. He stopped, thought about how to say the next part honestly. I'm not easy. I know that. I leave things too long. I don't always say what I'm thinking until it's overdue. My winters are hard and my springs are harder, and there's always something wrong with something on this ranch, and that's not going to change. Garrett, she said, I'm trying to say this honestly. I know you are, she said. Let me. He stopped. She looked at him across the table with that steadiness, the one he'd first seen on a train platform in November when a man had said something cruel in a loud voice, and she'd stood there, not flinched, and found the person who needed to be found. I know who you are, she said. I've been watching you for 5 months. I know you leave things too long, and I know your winters are hard, and I know you're not easy. She paused. I'm not easy either. I'm large, and I'm direct, and I make decisions before I explain them, and I reorganize things without asking, and my sons are loud and complicated, and mine. I know, he said, and you're asking anyway. I'm asking because of all of it, he said, not in spite of it. She looked at the table for a moment, at her hands. My husband, she said. When he was alive, we had a good marriage, not a perfect one, a real one, with the arguments and the hard years and the times one of us was wrong and had to come back to it. She looked up. I wasn't looking for that again. After he died and the years got hard, I stopped looking for anything. I was just trying to get somewhere stable. And, he said, and somewhere along the way this stopped being somewhere stable and started being somewhere I wanted to be, she said. And those are different things. She looked at him. Yes, she said. I'll marry you. He exhaled. He hadn't known he'd been holding that breath, but he had been. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. They sat there for a moment. Then she said, the boys. I want to talk to them, he said. Each of them, properly. She nodded. Nathan first. He'll need to hear it directly from you. I know. And Elias will have questions, practical ones. I know that too. She almost smiled. And Micah will ask if he can call you something other than Mr. Holloway. He looked at her. What do you want him to call me? Garrett said. She looked at him with the closest thing to warmth in her expression that didn't erase the steadiness underneath it. That should be between you and him, she said. He nodded. He looked at the lamp. I should have asked you properly months ago, he said. I was working up to it longer than I needed to. Yes, she said. You were. He looked at her. You knew. I had a sense, she said, and you waited. Some things need to be said in the person's own time, she said. I've learned not to rush the saying of them. He thought about that, about the things he'd left long and the things she'd waited on and the way they'd arrived, eventually, at the same place. Mabel, he said. Thank you for getting on that train. She looked at him. The steadiness was still there, and underneath it something that was warmer and older and harder won than steadiness. The agency made a mistake, she said. The agency made the best mistake I've ever benefited from, he said. She picked up her pen. She looked at her provision planning. Go talk to Nathan, she said. He'll be awake. He's always awake until 9. He stood. He got his hat from the peg. At the door he stopped. You knew, he said again, for a while. She didn't look up from the ledge, but the corner of her mouth moved. Go, she said. He went. Nathan was on the porch. He was sitting on the top step with his knees up and his arms on his knees, looking at the dark yard the way he looked at things when he was thinking. He looked up when the door opened. Garrett sat down on the step beside him. Not in a chair, on the step, side by side, looking at the same dark yard. After a while, Nathan said, You talked to her. I did. Nathan nodded slowly. He pulled at a loose thread on his cuff. What did she say? He said. She said yes. Nathan nodded again. The thread came loose and he looked at it and set it down. I want to say something, Nathan said. And I want to say it right, so I'm going to think for a second. Garrett waited. Nathan said, My father was a good man, the best man I knew. And I've spent 3 years thinking that nobody could be, that there wasn't. He stopped, started again. I'm not saying you're replacing him. I know you're not. You know you're not. I know, Garrett said. But I've been watching you for 5 months, Nathan said. The way you talked to Elias about the records, the way you went back for those 6 cattle, the way you told me it was right to protect my mother even when I was doing it badly. He looked at the yard. And I've been trying to figure out how to be grateful for that without feeling like I'm betraying something. Garrett said, You're not betraying anything. I know, Nathan said. I know that now. He picked up the loose thread again and let it go. He would have liked you, my father. He would have said, he paused. He would have said you're the kind of man who means what he does. They were quiet for a while. Garrett said, I can't promise I'll get everything right. Nobody can, Nathan said, but I'll try to be honest about when I get it wrong. Nathan looked at him. That's most of it, he said. That's most of what anyone needs. They sat on the step for a while longer in the dark, and the spring night was cold but less cold than it had been, and the mountains were there in the way they're always there, patient and specific and completely indifferent to human arrangement, which is not a cold indifference but a neutral one, the kind that leaves you to figure things out yourself and trusts that you can. When Garrett went back inside, the kitchen was empty but the lamp was still lit. On the table next to the provision ledger there was a cup of coffee, still warm. He stood there for a moment looking at it. He thought about everything that had not been on the list he'd written in November, the list that was all practical, all manageable, all the things a man tells himself he needs when he's learned to ask for less than what's true. He thought about what 5 months could hold if you let it. What could take root in hard ground when the conditions were finally right? He thought about Micah's hawk finding its wings, about Elias's records, preserved so that things wouldn't be gone without proof they were real, about Nathan sitting on the porch choosing gratitude without betrayal, about Jonah fixing the screw he'd gotten wrong. He thought about Mabel stepping off that train with 4 boys at her back and a hard life behind her and not 1 ounce of apology in her for any of it. He sat down. He picked up the cup. The fire was low. The house was quiet. Somewhere in the back, one of the boys was still moving around, doing whatever it is that boys do at the end of a day when the house feels safe enough to move slowly through. That sound. That specific sound of a child moving through a house without hurrying, without checking the exits, without bracing. That was the thing. That was what you built a life toward, if you were honest about it. Not the cattle numbers or the provision ledgers or the settled water rights or even the warmth of a kitchen that someone had organized with competence and care. All of that mattered. All of that was real. But underneath it was this, the sound of someone who knew they were safe. Garrett Holloway sat at the kitchen table in the low lamplight with the coffee warming his hands, and he thought that the best thing a person can do, maybe the only thing that matters when you strip everything else away, is to build a place where that sound is possible. He had not built it alone. He had needed every one of them. And that, in the end, was the thing he had not known to put on any list. That needing people was not a weakness in the plan, but the plan itself. That a man who tries to run his life on a list of practical requirements is a man who has made peace with less than what's real. That sometimes the agency makes a mistake, and the mistake walks off a train in November with 4 boys and steady eyes and more capacity for hard work and genuine living than anyone in the valley had been willing to see. And the right answer, the only answer that the next spring and the one after that would prove out, was to look at what was actually there